Welcome to our comprehensive preparation platform for the CCEP certification, where we will bridge the gap between abstract regulatory requirements and practical operational excellence. This content is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. This is an unofficial, independently produced course and is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to the SCCE, Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, or any other regulatory body. The CCEP certification is a registered trademark of the SCCE. Always consult with a qualified legal professional regarding your organization's specific compliance obligations. In this opening module, we will establish the fundamental context of corporate compliance, tracing its evolution from its early beginnings to the robust standards defined by the federal sentencing guidelines. By enrolling in this course, you are committing to mastering the sophisticated frameworks required by the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission in today's complex global market. We will systematically dissect every critical component of an effective compliance program, ensuring you possess the technical knowledge needed to navigate high-stakes legal and ethical challenges. This curriculum is designed to transform you into a leader capable of mitigating systemic risk and driving organizational integrity through evidence-based governance. The history of corporate compliance has shifted significantly from simple rule following to the adoption of proactive, risk-based management systems. Early regulatory efforts were often reactive, focusing on penalties after a violation had already occurred. But the introduction of the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, specifically Chapter 8, fundamentally changed this trajectory. These guidelines provided the first clear governmental framework for institutionalizing ethics, establishing a blueprint that every compliance professional must now treat as their foundational reference. When organizational programs are evaluated today by regulators like the DOJ, they are measured against their ability to demonstrate effectiveness in both design and implementation. This means that merely having a policy on paper is insufficient. You must be able to prove that those standards are integrated into the actual daily business operations of your organization. As we progress through the subsequent modules, you will explore the specific mechanics behind risk assessments, communication strategies, and the critical role of auditing and monitoring. Effective compliance is not a static state of being, but a continuous improvement cycle that requires constant vigilance regarding internal investigations and the enforcement of disciplinary actions. We will examine how to balance global policy development while ensuring that your organization maintains a strong tone at the top, which serves as the bedrock for a sustainable culture of ethics. You will learn how to identify potential hazards, prioritize those risks according to their impact, and implement internal controls that safeguard against both legal and reputational harm. By the end of this course, you will have moved beyond memorizing definitions and gain the capacity to build, maintain, and defend a comprehensive compliance infrastructure. I look forward to guiding you through these essential concepts as we prepare you for the exam. Welcome to this chapter, where we will examine the foundational elements of organizational standards and the frameworks that govern effective compliance programs. By mastering these core concepts, you will gain the clarity required to build robust systems that demonstrate a genuine commitment to ethical conduct in any corporate environment. When we talk about the foundations of standards, we are essentially discussing the blueprint that keeps an organization within the bounds of both legal requirements and ethical expectations. The U.S. federal sentencing guidelines represent perhaps the most critical framework here, particularly Chapter 8, which outlines the 7 elements of an effective compliance and ethics program. These elements are not merely suggestions, but serve as the bedrock for demonstrating that a company has exercised due diligence. When you look at the Department of Justice guidance or OIG compliance program manuals, you see a common theme. Compliance must move beyond paper-based policy. It must be an integrated force that resides within the daily operations of the business, rather than sitting in a siloed department. A standard is useless if it exists only in a digital repository. It must inform every decision, from the boardroom down to the frontline staff. The complexity of modern global business requires that your standards address a broad array of regulatory risks, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the UK Bribery Act, and various data privacy regulations like GDPR or CCPA. Managing these risks demands a sophisticated approach to policy lifecycle management. encompassing everything from initial drafting and approval to specific attestation and enforcement protocols. You cannot simply implement a global policy and expect compliance without considering local nuances and the operational reality of different business units. This is where cross-functional collaboration becomes essential, as legal, HR, and operational teams must align on how these policies will be executed. Accountability metrics and the tracking of attestations provide the data necessary to prove that your control environment is functioning as intended. Without this structured life cycle, you lose the ability to demonstrate a proactive rather than reactive compliance posture. Establishing the tone at the top is a concept that is frequently mentioned but rarely defined with enough operational rigor. It requires middle management to internalize compliance standards so that they become the default operating procedure for their subordinates. When you consider conflicts of interest, gifts, and entertainment, your policies must provide clear, objective frameworks for decision-making. These standards are not designed to hinder business, but to protect the organization from inherent risks that, if left unmanaged, could lead to significant legal exposure. Consistent benchmarking against best practices allows you to refine these standards, ensuring they remain resilient in the face of changing regulatory landscapes or market conditions. By maintaining a focus on these foundational elements, you move from a state of mere rule following to a state of sustained ethical integrity that is embedded in the very architecture of your company. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore the mechanical and philosophical underpinnings of developing a robust code of conduct that satisfies regulatory expectations. Drafting a code of conduct is not merely an exercise in writing a document. It is the act of establishing the core identity of an organization's ethical culture. The federal sentencing guidelines emphasize that an effective compliance program must begin with clear, written standards. When you sit down to draft these materials, you are essentially creating a North Star for every employee, from the boardroom to the front line. A code that sits in a digital drawer is a liability, but one that is actively integrated into daily business operations serves as a functional tool for decision-making. You must consider that auditors, under the DOJ's evaluation criteria, look beyond the text to determine how these standards inform behavioral expectations. Your goal is to move past boilerplate language and formulate a document that genuinely addresses the specific risks inherent to your industry and operational footprint. To draft an effective code, you must first bridge the gap between abstract ethical principles and concrete business scenarios. Begin by framing the code around universal values, but pivot quickly to the specific regulatory requirements that dictate your reality, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act. Employees often struggle with abstract concepts, so your task is to provide enough specificity to guide them through gray areas, such as the acceptance of gifts and entertainment. If you are developing a global policy, you must account for cultural nuance while maintaining a consistent standard of conduct that satisfies the strictest applicable laws. This is where cross-functional collaboration becomes essential. If you draft the code in isolation, you risk creating a document that is fundamentally incompatible with the realities of sales, procurement, or human resources. You must involve these stakeholders early to ensure that the code is perceived as a relevant framework rather than an administrative burden imposed by the legal department. The structural integrity of your code depends on your ability to define the expectations for middle management and the tone at the top. Accountability metrics must be embedded within the policy, suggesting that the document is not merely a statement of intent, but a contract of conduct. This requires a clear mechanism for attestations, where employees acknowledge their understanding of the standards and their obligation to report concerns. When considering risks such as antitrust, fair competition, or data privacy under frameworks like GDPR or CCPA, the code should act as a gateway to more detailed standard operating procedures. By clearly flagging these risk areas, you provide employees with the necessary signposts for when they need to pause and seek further guidance. Remember that a code is a living, breathing entity. It must be designed with the understanding that it will require constant review to reflect the changing regulatory landscape. As you refine the language of your code, focus on clarity, accessibility, and the practical enforcement of the standards you set. Avoid dense legal jargon that obscures the intent of the guidance, as the primary audience is the workforce itself. Instead, focus on defining what constitutes a conflict of interest, the specific thresholds for disclosure, and the consequences of failing to adhere to the company's ethical baseline. This is about managing the life cycle of your compliance messaging, ensuring that the code is supported by ongoing training and meaningful dialogue. If a policy is too vague, it leads to inconsistent application, which is a significant factor in failing to mitigate residual risks. Use the code to define these boundaries precisely, and you will find that the auditing and monitoring of compliance becomes significantly more straightforward. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the critical processes involved in developing global policies that align with regulatory frameworks and organizational objectives. Developing a global compliance policy is not merely an exercise in drafting text. It is the construction of a governance architecture that must function across diverse legal environments. When you draft policies for a global audience, you are effectively translating the high-level intent of the federal sentencing guidelines into actionable instructions for employees in different jurisdictions. A primary challenge here is balancing the need for a unified corporate standard with the realities of local laws and cultural nuances. For example, a global anti-bribery policy must remain consistent with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, yet it must also account for specific provisions in the UK Bribery Act or SOPIN 2. If you fail to account for these local variances, your policy may become unenforceable or, worse, create conflicts that put employees in legal jeopardy. Your goal is to establish a core set of values that remains immutable while building in flexibility to accommodate regional regulatory requirements. Effective policy development requires deep collaboration with cross-functional partners, including legal, human resources, and local business leaders. If you attempt to draft these documents in isolation, you will likely create a policy that is technically sound but operationally detached from the daily business. Think about the impact of data privacy regulations like GDPR or CCPA. These are not just legal hurdles, but operational realities that affect how information flows through your systems. When you build your global policy framework, you need to embed clear definitions of roles and responsibilities to ensure accountability. This means specifying exactly who is responsible for oversight, enforcement, and mandatory reporting when a policy breach occurs. By involving business unit managers early in the drafting process, you ensure that the policies are perceived as practical guides rather than theoretical obstacles. Once the core policies are drafted, they must be translated into standardized operating procedures that resonate with your specific operational context. This is the transition from abstract principle to concrete action, where you define exactly what is expected of an employee during a potential conflict of interest or when receiving a gift or entertainment from a third party. As you harmonize these standards, consider how they interact with existing export controls and sanctions regimens, such as those mandated by OFAC. A policy that is confusing or overly cumbersome will invariably lead to poor adoption rates and an increase in residual risk for the organization. You are not writing for lawyers, but for the professionals who need to navigate these ethical landscapes daily. Therefore, the language must be direct, accessible, and devoid of unnecessary jargon that could obscure the core compliance expectations. Consistency across your global operations is maintained through a rigorous process of policy lifecycle management, which includes everything from the approval phase to ongoing review cycles. It is not sufficient to launch a policy and consider the work finished. You must establish a system for distribution and tracking that verifies the audience has actually acknowledged the content. Attestations are a critical component here, as they provide an auditable trail of compliance awareness that serves as evidence of an effective program under DOJ criteria. You should treat your policies as living documents that require periodic reevaluation based on new regulatory developments or changes in your business footprint. If your audit results consistently show a lack of understanding in a particular department, that is an indicator that your policies or their associated training materials need a clear, objective revision. The ultimate success of your policy framework depends on your ability to integrate these standards into the firm's existing organizational culture. This involves establishing clear metrics to track how well your policies are being implemented and whether they are reducing the inherent risks they were designed to manage. When you establish these metrics, you provide leadership with the data necessary to demonstrate their commitment to an ethical environment. Accountability must reach from the top executive levels down to the managers who influence local site behavior. Without this integration, your policy library remains a disconnected set of binders, failing to provide the protection that both the board and regulators expect. A well-constructed policy suite acts as the foundation upon which all other investigative and monitoring activities are built. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and let's dive into the mechanics of managing an organization's standards from inception to retirement. We will examine the structured approach required to keep internal governance documents living and effective. A policy lifecycle must be viewed as an iterative process rather than a static administrative burden, because compliance standards that remain frozen in time quickly lose relevance. When we talk about the lifecycle, we begin with the identification of a regulatory requirement or an internal risk that necessitates a documented control. This drafting process requires precise language that is accessible to the workforce, avoiding overly legalistic jargon that obscures the intent of the rule. Once drafted, a policy must undergo a formal approval process involving key stakeholders, such as legal, human resources, and the functional business units affected by the requirements. Approval is not merely a formality, but a commitment from leadership that this policy is necessary and enforceable within the specific context of your business operations. Establishing this accountability early ensures that when the policy is distributed, it carries the weight of authority. Distribution methods form the next critical juncture in this life cycle, as simply saving a document to an intranet repository rarely satisfies the requirement for a truly effective compliance program. Employees must be alerted, educated, and required to certify their understanding of the standards through formal attestations. These attestations act as a documented acknowledgement that the individual has read, understood, and agreed to comply with the defined rules. Beyond this, lifecycle management demands a robust training strategy that moves beyond check-the-box compliance and addresses the practical applications of the policy in daily tasks. Effective training bridges the gap between the written text of a policy and the actual behavioral expectations during a high-stakes scenario. Without this translation, your distributed policies remain abstract concepts that provide little protection when regulators examine your operational efficacy. Integration into daily business operations requires ensuring that the policy is not just a digital asset, but a component of the decision-making process. This entails mapping compliance requirements to existing internal procedures and ensuring that supervisors are knowledgeable enough to provide real-time guidance to their teams. Collaboration across functions, such as linking procurement policies with vendor due diligence or HR policies with disciplinary processes, is the hallmark of a mature compliance organization. If a department is executing a business function without a clear link to the underlying policy, you have identified a vulnerability that demands immediate remediation. You should continuously monitor these intersections to ensure that changing business practices do not create unintended gaps. When a policy is ignored because it hinders operations, you must evaluate whether the policy is clear, whether it is too restrictive, or if the process itself was flawed. The most vital phase of the life cycle is the formal review and update mechanism, which acts as the pulse of your compliance program. Organizations must establish a regular cadence for auditing and potentially revising policies to reflect changes in the regulatory landscape, such as updates to the FCPA, GDPR, or specific industry guidelines. If an audit suggests that a policy is not being followed, you should not assume that the workforce is failing, but rather that the training, communication, or the policy itself may require adjustment. This corrective loop is essential for maintaining the integrity of the compliance program in the eyes of regulators like the Department of Justice. By documenting these reviews, you provide proof that your program is not static, but actively managed and responsive to emerging threats. This cycle of drafting, training, monitoring, and updating ensures that your compliance framework remains as dynamic as the risks it is designed to mitigate. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on integrating business operations into your compliance framework. We will examine how to weave ethical standards directly into the fabric of daily organizational activity. Integrating business operations signifies a shift from viewing compliance as a static manual on a shelf to an active, dynamic component of commercial decision-making. When we talk about this integration, we are effectively discussing the alignment of the federal sentencing guidelines expectations with the practical realities of corporate workflows. This requires moving beyond merely drafting policies. It necessitates embedding those policies into standard operating procedures and internal controls. If your sales department initiates a new contract, the compliance check should be as automatic and integrated as a credit check or an inventory update. By cross-pollinating departments, you create a shared responsibility model where legal, finance, HR, and operations view compliance not as a roadblock, but as a standard parameter of their specific business functions. The complexity of modern global operations means that your compliance program must account for a myriad of legal frameworks simultaneously, such as the FCPA, UKBA, SOP 2, and various data privacy regulations like GDPR or CCPA. These laws are not abstract academic concepts. They are constraints that dictate how data flows through your servers and how agents interact with foreign officials. Integrating these requirements demands a continuous policy lifecycle management approach, where policies are created, vetted, approved, and then pushed out to the specific operational units that need them most. You cannot expect a general policy to govern a localized procurement process in a subsidiary abroad without accounting for cultural nuances and regional legal variations. Therefore, mapping your business processes against these global risks allows you to identify where compliance controls are missing or where they might be redundant. A crucial aspect of this integration is the establishment of clear accountability metrics that reach from the executive suite down through middle management. Tone at the top is a popular catchphrase, but in practice, it means that top-level support must translate into tangible performance incentives. If you track compliance attestations as a key performance indicator within a business unit's quarterly review, you fundamentally alter the internal calculus of that unit. This is how you bridge the gap between abstract ethical goals and the hard reality of daily deliverables. Successful integration ensures that auditing and monitoring are not just reactive measures taken after a violation occurs, but are baked into the architectural design of your systems to detect anomalies in real time. Addressing specific risks like gifts, entertainment, and conflicts of interest requires high-resolution visibility into what employees are actually doing on the ground. When your procurement system triggers a secondary verification for expenses above a certain threshold involving government-affiliated entities, you are demonstrating operational integration. This effectively manages both inherent and residual risks by placing an automated speed bump where the danger of bribery or corruption is highest. The continuous review and improvement of these automated controls ensure that as your business pivots to new markets or introduces new products, the compliance framework maintains its relevance. This methodology transforms your compliance program into a living interface that evolves alongside the business, rather than being a rigid bureaucratic structure that inevitably gets bypassed in the name of efficiency. See you in the next lesson. Hello. Let us look at the essential practice of benchmarking your compliance program against established industry standards. This chapter provides the roadmap you need to ensure your organization's ethics framework remains robust, defensible, and fully aligned with regulatory expectations. Benchmarking is not an exercise in vanity, but a critical mechanism for assessing whether your compliance activities satisfy the high bar set by authoritative bodies. When you benchmark, you are essentially looking at your internal processes through the lens of external frameworks like the Federal Sentencing Guidelines, Chapter 8. These guidelines articulate the 7 fundamental elements of an effective compliance program, which serve as the baseline for any mature organization. By comparing your current state against these criteria, you identify gaps in areas such as organizational oversight, training, and auditing. If your program does not map clearly to these 7 elements, you are essentially flying blind in the event of a regulatory inquiry. The Department of Justice, through its guidance on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, expects this structural alignment as a prerequisite for any meaningful defense. Beyond the sentencing guidelines, you must examine specific industry guidance, such as the Voluntary Compliance Program guidance manuals provided by the Office of Inspector General. These documents provide sector-specific nuances that generic frameworks often lack, particularly concerning the risks inherent in healthcare or financial services environments. Effective benchmarking requires you to evaluate your policy lifecycle management, from the initial draft of a code of conduct to the final enforcement of standard operating procedures. You must look at how your global and local policies translate into daily business operations, ensuring that compliance is not a siloed function, but an integrated component of how work actually gets done. If your policies are pristine on paper but disconnected from the workflow of your regional offices, your benchmarking process will quickly reveal that lack of operational effectiveness. This internal audit of your own maturity is the only way to establish credibility with regulators who prioritize substance over mere formal policy documentation. A significant portion of your benchmarking activity should focus on your response to global corruption and financial integrity mandates, such as the FCPA, the UK Bribery Act, and SAPIN 2. You are expected to demonstrate that your program is not static, but is actively evolving in response to the specific antitrust, fair competition, and data privacy landscapes like GDPR, CCPA, or HIPAA. Benchmarking against best practices involves assessing whether your mid-level leadership is actually accountable for compliance or if it is solely delegated to the compliance department. You should review your metrics for attestations, gift and entertainment tracking, and the management of export controls or OFAC sanctions. By mapping your controls against these benchmarks, you can discern whether your current monitoring and auditing programs are sufficient to detect potential misconduct before it escalates. This systematic review helps you distinguish between inherent risks, those risks present in your specific industry, and the residual risks that remain after your controls are applied. Integration demands that you treat policy management as a continuous cycle rather than a set-it-and-forget-it project. Your review process should be rhythmic, incorporating input from cross-functional teams to ensure that policies reflect current operational realities rather than outdated requirements. During this phase of your assessment, focus on how you capture and analyze data from internal reporting channels to feed back into your policy updates. If you find that employees repeatedly struggle with a specific anti-corruption procedure, your benchmarking efforts indicate that the policy requires refinement or that the underlying training is failing to translate into understanding. By constantly testing your program's performance against industry benchmarks, you shift from a reactive posture to one of proactive risk mitigation. This methodical approach ensures that when auditors come knocking, you are prepared to show not just that you have policies, but that you have built a program that actually performs its intended function under pressure. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this chapter, we discuss organizational governance and the fundamental role you, as a compliance professional, play in maintaining a compliant and ethical enterprise. The role of a chief compliance officer is often romanticized, yet it is rooted in the pragmatic reality of organizational governance. You are not merely a consultant. You are the guardian of a governance structure that must operate with independence and authority. To be effective, the CCO must exist outside the direct influence of the business units they are tasked with monitoring. This requires a reporting structure that bypasses standard operational management, connecting directly to the board or its dedicated audit or compliance committees. When a compliance officer reports directly to the CEO, they may face inherent conflicts of interest that could compromise their ability to sound the alarm on executive misconduct. By establishing these clear, autonomous lines of communication, the organization demonstrates to regulatory bodies that its compliance function is empowered, not merely ornamental. Independence is a non-negotiable DOJ requirement that dictates how a compliance function is perceived and how it functions in practice. A CCO needs more than just a reporting line. They require adequate funding and resources to perform their duties without begging for budget from the same departments they might be auditing. If you are forced to justify every forensic accounting audit or specialized training session as a cost-cutting burden, your influence is tethered by financial constraints. True autonomy means you possess the authority to conduct inquiries, access corporate records, and enforce policies without prior approval from those you are investigating. Without these structural safeguards, your role risks becoming a symbolic gesture rather than a meaningful barrier against systemic risk. Governance is also fundamentally linked to the concept of fiduciary duties, specifically the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. These are not abstract legal concepts. They are the bedrock upon which board oversight is built, as highlighted by landmark cases like Caremark. The Caremark standards require boards to implement a reporting system that provides them with timely, accurate information about compliance risks. Failure to monitor, as reiterated in cases like Stone versus Ritter or Marchand versus Barnhill, can lead to personal liability for directors. Your role as a CCO is to feed this system, ensuring that the oversight mechanism is not just a perfunctory review of quarterly reports. You must provide the board with the granular data and risk analytics they need to satisfy their legal obligations to the share owners. Risk management serves as the bridge between your compliance framework and daily business operations. You must constantly evaluate the organizational risk profile by distinguishing between inherent risk, which is the risk present before any mitigation, and residual risk, which is what remains after your controls are in place. This involves measuring risk based on likelihood, impact, and velocity. How quickly a risk can materialize and damage the firm. You need to leverage frameworks like COSO to ensure that internal controls are not just theoretical documents, but functional barriers. This includes maintaining proper segregation of duties so that no single employee has the capability to initiate, approve, and execute a fraudulent transaction without detection. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of your role is the intangible work of fostering a culture of integrity. Culture is not driven by the employee handbook. It is driven by the tone at the top, the tone in the middle, and the accountability of leadership. When the CCO works with management committees or ethics boards to influence performance metrics, they are essentially aligning employee behavior with institutional values. Tying compensation to compliance objectives is one of the most effective ways to signal that the company prioritizes legal behavior over short-term gains. Furthermore, implementing clawback provisions creates a tangible deterrent, proving that the organization will not tolerate executives who sacrifice long-term health for temporary profit. I look forward to continuing our discussion on governance in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the critical role of board oversight in maintaining a robust compliance and ethics program within an organization. Effective governance starts with the board of directors, which functions as the ultimate steward of an organization's ethical health. The oversight responsibility mandates that directors do not merely sign off on reports, but actively engage with the compliance infrastructure to understand risks. Legally, directors are held to specific fiduciary duties, primarily the duty of care and the duty of loyalty. The duty of care requires directors to act on an informed basis after considering all material information reasonably available, while the duty of loyalty demands that they place the interests of the corporation and its shareholders above their own personal interests. When these obligations are neglected, the organization faces significant legal jeopardy. The landmark Caremark case established that a board must implement a reporting system to ensure it receives timely and accurate information regarding compliance risks. Without such a system, directors can be held personally liable for a failure of oversight. The evolution of these legal standards is best understood through subsequent case law that continues to refine the expectations for directors. The Stone versus Ritter decision later clarified that for a director to be held liable for a failure of oversight, there must be a sustained or systematic failure to exercise oversight, such as an utter failure to attempt to assure that a reasonable information and reporting system exists. More recently, cases like Marchand versus Barnhill have emphasized that food safety and other mission-critical compliance issues require the board to be uniquely focused on these areas. If a company operates in a highly regulated industry, the board cannot rely on general oversight. It must ensure specific, board-level monitoring of the risks fundamental to that business. This implies that the board must approve and review committee charters that clearly define these responsibilities. These charters serve as the formal instruments that delegate specific compliance tasks, ensuring that the burden of oversight is distributed and managed effectively across the governing body. Beyond legal expectations, the practical reality of compliance oversight requires that the Chief Compliance Officer maintains a direct reporting relationship with the board or its Audit or Compliance Committee. This structural connection is designed to ensure that the compliance function is not subordinated to the interests of management, who may have conflicting priorities regarding growth or performance targets. The board must verify that the compliance department has adequate funding, resources, and the necessary autonomy to conduct its activities without fear of retaliation or budget tightening based on unfavorable findings. This independence is not an optional feature, but a core requirement highlighted by the Department of Justice in evaluating the effectiveness of corporate compliance programs. When the board actively reviews these resource allocations, it signals to the rest of the organization that compliance is a non-negotiable priority. By maintaining this separation, the board ensures that potential misconduct can be investigated even when it involves senior leadership. Operational effectiveness is further supported by management committees, such as steering committees or ethics boards, which act as the bridge between the board and the general workforce. These committees facilitate the tactical implementation of policies and procedures that the board has authorized. While the board sets the strategy and monitors the overall risk profile, management is responsible for the daily execution of those directives. This includes the implementation of rigorous internal controls, such as the segregation of duties, which is a foundational concept in the COSO framework. By ensuring that one individual does not have control over all phases of a transaction, the organization limits the opportunity for fraud or error. The board's role here is to receive consistent, high-quality data regarding these controls, ensuring that they remain effective in a dynamic environment where inherent risks are constantly shifting. A significant portion of board oversight involves understanding and managing the risk profile of the entity, including both inherent and residual risks. The board must insist on receiving reports that quantify risk in terms of likelihood, impact, and velocity. With this information, the board can determine whether the current mitigation strategies are sufficient or whether additional internal controls need to be deployed. Furthermore, the board is instrumental in fostering a culture of accountability by tying executive compensation to compliance outcomes. Mechanisms like clawbacks provide a tangible deterrent against misconduct by ensuring that executives do not benefit from gains achieved through unethical practices. When the board demonstrates this level of commitment, it shapes the tone at the top, directly influencing the ethical behavior of employees at all levels of the firm. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the structural requirements of a robust compliance program. Today, we turn our attention to the critical concept of ensuring independence for the compliance function. Independence is not merely a theoretical construct, but a fundamental operational requirement mandated by the Department of Justice and other regulatory bodies. For a compliance program to function effectively, the Chief Compliance Officer must operate without the chilling effects of internal conflict or undue influence from operational management. This requires that the compliance function maintains a clear, direct reporting line to the Board of Directors or its designated committee, such as the Audit or Compliance Committee. When a Chief Compliance Officer reports directly to the CEO, they may be hampered by the very operational interests they are tasked with overseeing. By elevating the reporting line beyond the reach of day-to-day management, the organization signals that compliance possesses the autonomy necessary to flag material issues without fear of retaliation. This structure ensures that ethical considerations are not subordinate to short-term financial targets. Autonomy is the shield that allows a compliance officer to remain objective during heated internal disputes. Without this protected status, the program risks becoming a checkbox exercise rather than a genuine safeguard. Achieving independence also necessitates adequate access to resources, including a dedicated budget that is not subject to arbitrary cuts by the departments being audited or monitored. If the compliance department must ask for permission from a business unit leader to fund its own investigations or training initiatives, its independence is effectively compromised. DOJ guidance consistently highlights that a compliance program should be adequately resourced to perform its mission, which implies that the funding should be independent of the operational business units. This financial autonomy ensures that the compliance office can engage external auditors, retain legal counsel, or procure investigative tools without the need to justify those expenses to the stakeholders under scrutiny. You should view this budget control as a litmus test for the organization's commitment to an ethical culture. When resources are shielded from operational control, the compliance officer can operate with the fortitude required to handle sensitive matters appropriately. It is about creating an environment where the compliance officer is an internal auditor and not a subordinate of the operational machine. The structural placement of the compliance function is further bolstered by the application of fiduciary duties and governance standards. Legal precedents establish that directors have a duty of care and a duty of loyalty to the corporation, which mandates active oversight of the company's compliance and risk management systems. The Caremark standard, later reinforced by rulings like Stone versus Ritter and Marchand versus Hill, requires boards to be informed of material risks and to implement reporting systems that allow them to address those risks. By ensuring that the Chief Compliance Officer has unencumbered access to the board, the organization fulfills its oversight obligations while reinforcing the independence of the compliance function. A board that is kept at arm's length from the compliance reality is a board that cannot fulfill its fiduciary duties. Ensuring independence is not about creating an adversarial relationship with management, but rather creating a system of checks and balances where independent oversight is baked into the governance structure itself. When you are evaluating an organization's maturity, always look for this insulation between compliance authority and operational influence. Independence is also maintained through the segregation of duties, ensuring that those who design the controls are not the same individuals who execute or approve them. If the Chief Compliance Officer is also the head of legal or the Chief Financial Officer, the potential for conflicts of interest becomes significant. While smaller organizations might combine roles due to resource constraints, the golden rule remains that the compliance role must be distinct enough to provide an objective challenge to the business. This separation helps in the identification of internal controls that actually function rather than those that simply exist on paper. By maintaining a separate mandate, the Compliance Office acts as a neutral party capable of detecting misconduct without the burden of serving two masters. This structural integrity is the backbone upon which all other compliance initiatives depend. If independence is lacking, even the most sophisticated policies and procedures will ultimately fail to prevent the next regulatory catastrophe. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we turn our attention to the operational reality of ensuring the Chief Compliance Officer possesses the requisite authority to function effectively within a complex corporate structure. When we talk about the authority of a compliance officer, we are not merely discussing a title or a description on an organizational chart. Effective authority is substantiated through direct, unencumbered reporting lines that bypass potential conflicts of interest, specifically reporting to the board of directors or an independent audit committee. The Department of Justice, particularly within its guidance on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, makes it quite clear that this reporting structure is non-negotiable. If a compliance officer has to report to the general counsel or the CFO, their independence is structurally compromised, which often creates an inherent bias toward protecting the legal entity's immediate financial or litigation interests rather than fostering an ethical culture. True authority manifests when the compliance program has enough status to challenge management decisions without fear of arbitrary or retaliatory consequences. This autonomy must be codified in specific charters that clearly define the role's scope and mandate, ensuring that the officer can execute their responsibilities without seeking permission from those they are meant to oversee. Financial and operational resource allocation serves as the primary metric for testing whether an organization truly empowers its compliance function. It is common to see a compliance program that looks robust on paper but suffers from chronic underfunding or internal obstacles when it attempts to conduct deep dive investigations. Authority is demonstrated when the officer has sufficient autonomy to decide which risks are prioritized, which internal controls are necessary, and how the budget is deployed to address those specific gaps. If management can arbitrarily restrict access to data, personnel, or external expertise, the compliance officer lacks the authority required to manage the organization's risk profile objectively. This is fundamentally linked to the internal control environment, where segregation of duties forms a critical defense against misconduct that could originate from the same individuals who hold power over the compliance function itself. By ensuring the compliance officer holds the power to pause or redirect business operations that pose an unacceptable level of residual risk, the organization verifies that the program is not restricted to a ceremonial role. Governance structures must bridge the gap between high-level oversight and the day-to-day enforcement of policies, creating a cohesive framework that is difficult to ignore. This often involves the use of steering committees or compliance boards that include various functional leaders, which helps distribute the responsibility for ethical conduct across the firm. These management committees act as a verification layer where policies and procedures are not just approved, but subjected to rigorous review before their implementation. Within this ecosystem, your authority as a compliance professional is supported by the formal adoption of standards like the COSO framework for internal controls. When you can point to these established benchmarks, you are no longer expressing a personal opinion. You are enforcing a standard that represents the best practices for the organization. Providing this level of institutional backing removes the personal nature of friction between the compliance office and the business, substituting it with a system where performance metrics and accountability are clear. Finally, we have to consider the long-term impact on risk mitigation strategies when authority is properly established from the top down. The ability to monitor, audit, and audit-proof your activities hinges on the fact that your mandate is clearly communicated to the entire organization. Employees are far more likely to respect the compliance function when they understand that the Chief Compliance Officer has the express backing of the Board of Directors to act on their findings. This influence extends into how the company approaches leadership accountability, where performance reviews and compensation packages are directly tied to compliance and ethics milestones. When internal controls are functioning correctly, you ensure that even the most powerful executives know that their authority is subject to the same compliance constraints as any other employee within the organization. This level of consistency is the hallmark of a mature governance framework, preventing the isolation of the compliance function and embedding it deep into the organizational nervous system. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of organizational governance structures. In this lesson, we will focus on the role and operational necessity of management committees within a robust compliance framework. Management committees serve as a vital bridge between the overarching strategic direction set by the Board of Directors and the actual day-to-day operations of the enterprise. While the board maintains fiduciary oversight, management committees provide the granular, functional governance required to steer complex compliance initiatives. These entities, often structured as ethics committees or compliance steering groups, act as the deliberate mechanism through which compliance policies transition from static documents into actionable operational realities. By delegating oversight to these cross-functional groups, an organization ensures that various business units are not operating in silos, but are instead aligned with the established risk appetite. It is here that the intersection of business strategy and ethical behavior is most acutely negotiated and enforced. A well-structured management committee must possess clearly defined charters that outline its mandate, authority, and its relationships with other governance bodies. Without a formal charter, these committees often devolve into passive discussion groups that lack the power to make binding decisions or hold business owners accountable for non-compliance. These charters should explicitly reference the committee's reporting lines, typically flowing directly to the Chief Compliance Officer or the board's Audit Committee, to ensure that visibility remains high. By institutionalizing these oversight structures, the organization demonstrates to regulators that compliance is not an afterthought, but a central element of the management process. This is particularly relevant when considering the legal expectations for the duty of care, where management must demonstrate active, informed participation in the monitoring of corporate activities. Operational oversight via these committees involves a constant cycle of monitoring and adjustment, often utilizing the COSO framework to evaluate the effectiveness of internal controls. When a committee reviews risk profiles, it must consider both inherent risk, which is the risk present in the absence of controls, and residual risk, which remains after mitigation efforts are deployed. This is where the concepts of likelihood, impact, and velocity become critical tools for committee members to prioritize their focus. If a committee identifies that a specific business unit is experiencing a spike in misconduct indicators, they have the mandate to implement immediate tactical changes or mandate higher levels of segregation of duties. Consequently, the committee does not just receive reports, it actively functions as a preventative engine for the entire enterprise. Beyond operational monitoring, management committees are instrumental in translating governance standards into measurable performance metrics. It is common for high-performing organizations to link executive compensation directly to adherence to stated compliance objectives. When a committee is tasked with overseeing these metrics, they are responsible for ensuring that the criteria for rewards and the application of clawbacks remain transparent and consistent. This visibility helps shift the organizational perception of compliance from a restrictive cost center to a core component of sustainable leadership. By tying accountability to these structures, the CCO ensures that the program is supported by the actual, documented behavior of the senior management team. Ultimately, these committees provide the necessary stability to ensure that policies reflect the evolving external landscape while remaining anchored in reality. As business operations expand or transform, the governance structure must be capable of auditing and updating these policies in real time, rather than waiting for annual review cycles. This agility requires a committee that is empowered to challenge business leaders and demand remediation when internal controls are bypassed or deemed insufficient. By maintaining this constant vigilance, the management committee transforms the abstract concept of board oversight into a tangible, day-to-day defense against ethical failure. This structure remains the most effective method for embedding ethical rigor into the standard operating procedures of any modern organization. I look forward to discussing how these oversight concepts translate into departmental accountability in our next session. Welcome to the lesson on Tone at the Top, where we analyze how leadership signals define the boundaries of ethical behavior. Our objective is to understand how organizational culture propagates from the board level down to the frontline employees. Tone at the top is not merely a corporate buzzword, but a measurable component of organizational governance that the Department of Justice evaluates during enforcement actions. It represents the visible commitment of the board and senior leadership to the compliance program, which implicitly dictates the risk tolerance of the entire firm. When leaders consistently prioritize short-term profit over regulatory adherence, they inadvertently communicate that ethical shortcuts are acceptable, effectively eroding the compliance framework. Conversely, when leadership prioritizes ethics, they set a standard that influences every decision made within the middle management layer. This influence, often referred to as tone in the middle, requires that supervisors translate those high-level statements into actionable daily behaviors. If an executive ignores a policy to close a deal, that action resonates louder than any written document or training session ever could. True commitment signifies that the organization acts properly even when no one is watching, which is the definition of integrity. You must recognize that culture is essentially a collection of consistent behaviors sustained by the incentive structures put in place by leadership. To evaluate the strength of this tone, we must look at how performance metrics are structured and whether they explicitly include compliance objectives. A firm that links financial bonuses solely to sales volume without accounting for ethical conduct is practically guaranteeing a high-risk environment. Effective governance requires that management committees, including ethics boards and steering committees, have the authority to intervene regardless of the seniority of the individuals involved. Leadership accountability should not be theoretical. It must be enforced through mechanisms like clawbacks, which allow the firm to recover compensation if misconduct occurs. When employees observe that high-performing stars are disciplined or even terminated for compliance failures, the tone shift is immediate and profound. This is what regulators look for. Consistency is the primary indicator of a successful compliance culture. Without these concrete structures, any talk of ethics remains superficial and highly susceptible to the pressure of competitive market conditions. The governance structure must also account for consistent monitoring of inherent and residual risks to ensure that the tone being set is actually being followed. We identify inherent risk as the risk level before any controls are applied, while residual risk remains after the controls are meant to mitigate those initial threats. Your role as a professional is to ensure that these mitigation strategies, such as the segregation of duties, are functioning exactly as intended across all departments. The COSO framework provides a logical model for this, focusing on the integration of internal controls into the operational heartbeat of the company. If audits reveal a discrepancy between the stated values and the actual risk mitigation data, it is a clear sign that the tone at the top has failed to take hold. You must constantly evaluate the frequency, impact, and velocity of risks, keeping in mind that a complacent culture is always the greatest threat to a stable program. The evidence of a healthy culture is reflected in how an organization identifies, reports, and remediates misconduct without hesitation. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to the chapter on risk assessment, where we explore the methodologies for identifying and evaluating the compliance risks facing your organization. Risk identification stands as the essential bedrock upon which every effective compliance and ethics program is constructed. Without a clear understanding of what could go wrong, you are essentially flying blind, unable to effectively allocate your limited time and resources to where they are needed most. We treat risk identification as a structured process that moves beyond mere intuition. requiring a systematic approach to categorize and evaluate potential threats across the enterprise. This involves examining the inherent risk, the risk present in the absence of any controls, and evaluating how that risk changes once your current mitigating measures are applied, resulting in the residual risk. This distinction is vital because a compliance officer must understand whether an issue remains high risk despite existing policies, or if the control environment is successfully holding that risk at an acceptable level. When we break down the domains of risk, we typically look at categories such as financial, operational, strategic, legal, regulatory, and reputational risks. Each of these pillars requires a specific lens. For instance, regulatory risk might involve ensuring that your anti-bribery framework keeps you compliant with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act, while operational risk might focus on the internal processes that could inadvertently facilitate a breach. You must also consider the dimensions of likelihood, impact, and velocity when performing these evaluations. Likelihood speaks to the probability of an event occurring, while impact measures the severity of the consequences if that risk materializes. Velocity is often overlooked, yet it is critically important as it measures the speed at which a risk can impact the organization once the trigger event occurs, which is increasingly relevant in the age of viral social media scandals or instant data breaches. The actual execution of these assessments typically necessitates a blend of qualitative and quantitative techniques to gather a comprehensive picture. You will find that stakeholder interviews provide deep, contextual understanding that numbers alone cannot reveal, as these conversations often surface the lived experience of the risks that employees encounter daily. Simultaneously, document reviews, surveys, and rigorous data analytics help provide the objective evidence required to validate those perceptions. Once this data is gathered, you will often synthesize it into a risk register, which serves as a living document of all identified threats. From there, many organizations utilize heat maps to visualize the distribution of these risks, or more sophisticated tools like bowtie analyses, which help map the causal pathways between threats, barriers, and potential consequences. Focusing on the right areas is the primary goal of this exercise, specifically prioritizing high-stakes domains like antitrust laws, fair competition, and data privacy regulations such as the GDPR, CCPA, or HIPAA. Additionally, you must remain vigilant regarding export controls and economic sanctions enforced by bodies like OFAC, as these areas often carry severe penalties and intense regulatory scrutiny. It is important to remember that these risk profiles are not static artifacts to be filed away after a yearly review. Instead, they must be updated dynamically to reflect the reality of a changing organization, which might include aggressive mergers, new product lines entering untested markets, or shifts in the macroeconomic landscape. By continuously aligning your risk identification with these internal and external variables, you ensure that your audit plans, training curricula, and policy updates remain relevant and effective. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the essential elements of an effective compliance program. Today, we turn our attention to the critical task of prioritizing regulatory risks within your organization. In an ideal world, an organization would have infinite resources to mitigate every conceivable risk, but in practice, scarcity is the rule. Prioritization is the process of filtering an exhaustive list of potential hazards to identify where your limited compliance budget and human capital will generate the highest return on investment. You must begin by distinguishing between inherent risk, which exists before applying any controls, and residual risk, which remains after those controls are put in place. By evaluating these risks through the lenses of likelihood, impact, and velocity, you create a quantifiable framework that transforms abstract threats into actionable data. Velocity, in particular, is often overlooked, yet it is vital for understanding how quickly a risk could manifest and cause damage to your entity. Whether we are discussing corruption risks under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or data privacy requirements like the GDPR, your goal is to move beyond intuition toward a disciplined, objective model. Without this layer of prioritization, you risk spreading your compliance efforts too thin across low-utility activities while leaving catastrophic vulnerabilities unchecked. The actual mechanics of prioritization depend on the specific risk domains that define your unique organizational footprint. When we talk about global reach, we must factor in the UK Bribery Act, or the complex web of export controls and OFAC economic sanctions that can change overnight based on geopolitical shifts. Simultaneously, operational risks, such as antitrust behavior or data privacy obligations under CCPA or HIPAA, demand constant attention due to the severe financial and reputational consequences of noncompliance. You should visualize these priorities using tools such as risk registers or heat maps, which provide stakeholders with an intuitive view of which risks require immediate intervention versus those that can be monitored over the long term. For more complex hazards, a bow tie analysis can prove invaluable for mapping the causes of a potential failure to the consequences, thereby highlighting where preventative barriers are most critical. Remember that the goal is not to eliminate all risk, but to manage it to a level that aligns with the organization's stated risk appetite and board mandate. Prioritization is a dynamic endeavor rather than a one-time administrative exercise. Your risk profile must evolve in response to internal movements like mergers and acquisitions, the introduction of new product lines, or shifts in the corporate strategy. Externally, you must keep a watchful eye on changing enforcement trends and macroeconomic factors that can suddenly elevate a dormant risk to the front of your queue. By integrating the insights gathered from stakeholder interviews, document reviews, and data analytics, you ensure that your assessment reflects the reality of the business environment. This data-driven approach becomes the engine for your broader compliance strategy, informing everything from audit planning and training curricula to policy updates and resource allocation. Ideally, your risk assessment process feeds directly into your continuous monitoring priorities, creating a feedback loop that detects shifts in the risk landscape in real time. When you successfully prioritize, you empower your compliance function to act as a value-add partner that protects the organization from its most significant exposures. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to the program. In this lesson, we will focus on the practical application of anti-corruption frameworks and the specific demands of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, remains the gold standard for global anti-corruption compliance. At its core, the statute comprises two distinct but interrelated provisions: the anti-bribery provisions and the accounting provisions. The anti-bribery provisions prohibit the willful use of the mails or any means of interstate commerce corruptly in furtherance of an offer, payment, promise to pay, or authorization of the payment of money or anything of value to any person, while knowing that all or a portion of such money or thing of value will be offered, given, or promised to a foreign official to influence the official in their official capacity. The definition of a foreign official is notably broad, encompassing candidates for political office, political parties, and even employees of state-owned enterprises. When we perform a risk assessment, we must move beyond the narrow idea of just cash payments to government officials. We have to consider items of value, which includes travel, entertainment, internship opportunities for relatives, or charitable contributions made at the request of such officials. The enforcement of these rules is shared between the Department of Justice, which handles criminal prosecutions, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, which manages civil enforcement. Understanding your specific risk profile requires looking at your interaction with intermediaries, third parties, and local vendors who may operate in jurisdictions with high perception scores on transparency indices. The accounting provisions of the FCPA are equally critical, as they form the backbone of what regulators look for during an audit. These provisions require issuers to make and keep books, records, and accounts that, in reasonable detail, accurately and fairly reflect the transactions and dispositions of the assets of the issuer. Furthermore, companies must devise and maintain a system of internal accounting controls sufficient to provide reasonable assurances that transactions are executed in accordance with management's general or specific authorization. This is not merely an accounting exercise. It is a mechanism to prevent the creation of slush funds that facilitate hidden bribes. If you are documenting a payment to a consultant as professional services, but that money is actually being redirected to a government official, you are in violation of the books and records provisions, regardless of whether a bribery charge can be proven. This is why our internal control environment must be robust, requiring documentation that justifies the business purpose, the amount, and the recipient of every significant transaction. During your risk assessment process, you should map out where financial decisions are made and where the oversight is potentially weakest, particularly in international subsidiaries that have autonomy from the corporate office. Risk assessment methodologies for anti-corruption must be dynamic and reflective of the current enforcement landscape. We cannot rely on static spreadsheets that were accurate 3 years ago. We must evaluate the changing landscape of macroeconomic factors and regional legislative updates. If your organization enters a new market, that immediate change in geography often triggers a heightened risk profile that demands a fresh assessment of your intermediary relationships. You need to identify inherent risks based on the industry and the geography, and then evaluate your existing controls to determine the residual risk. If you find that the residual risk remains high, it is an indicator that your current controls, such as due diligence procedures or signatory authorities, are ineffective. We should employ techniques like bow tie analysis to visualize both the preventive controls that stop the bribery event from happening and the detective controls that identify the payment after the fact. Integrating this data into your broader compliance monitoring ensures that your risk management is not a siloed documentation project, but an operational imperative that informs your audit plan for the coming year. Finally, you must reconcile your compliance program's internal maturity with the expectations set by global enforcement bodies. The UK Bribery Act, for example, shares similarities with the FCPA, but includes the corporate offense of failure to prevent bribery, which shifts the burden of proof somewhat differently. Comparing your risk assessment results against these international standards provides a benchmark for identifying gaps in your current training curriculum. If your assessment shows a high dependency on third-party customs brokers in a specific region, your training should specifically target the employees responsible for managing those specific relationships. Policy updates must be consistent across the organization, ensuring that there is no ambiguity about the prohibition of facilitation payments, even if foreign local law might appear to allow them. Your risk register should prioritize these areas based on both the likelihood of occurrence and the severity of potential regulatory impact. Managing this risk is an ongoing process of continuous improvement, where the data you gather during periodic audits feeds directly back into the risk assessment cycle. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to our deep dive into data privacy fundamentals, where we will examine the principles that keep information secure and compliant. We will focus specifically on how these concepts integrate into your broader risk assessment framework. Data privacy is seldom a static requirement, but rather a reflection of evolving global expectations regarding individual autonomy and corporate responsibility. When we look at frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation or the California Consumer Privacy Act, we are essentially looking at sets of constraints that dictate how an organization manages the life cycle of personal information. From an architectural perspective, you should view data privacy as a cross-cutting concern that touches every layer of your business, from human resources handling employee records to marketing teams managing customer leads. This necessitates that your risk assessment methodology treats data as an asset with inherent liability if improperly handled. If you fail to map the flow of data through your internal systems, you cannot possibly identify the points where a breach or non-compliance event is likely to occur. It is not just about having a policy. It is about having a defensible mechanism to track, categorize, and protect sensitive information against unauthorized exposure or misuse. To effectively address privacy in your risk registry, you must move beyond generic compliance checkboxes and focus on the technical and procedural reality of data processing. Consider the principle of data minimization, which mandates that you only collect what you strictly need. This is both a technical constraint and a risk governance policy. When you assess risk in this domain, you should evaluate the likelihood of a data subject access request being mishandled or the impact of a potential unauthorized disclosure on your organization's reputation. Unlike financial risks, where outcomes are often quantifiable in currency, privacy risks frequently manifest as regulatory fines or an irreversible loss of trust within your customer base. You should evaluate these risks by looking at the velocity of data movement across borders, particularly when your organization operates in jurisdictions with diverging privacy mandates. By integrating these specific privacy markers into your routine risk identification methods, you provide the board with a more accurate picture of the organization's current exposure. The complexity increases when you account for the disparate nature of modern data ecosystems. which often involve third-party vendors and cloud service providers. Every time you push data outside of your controlled environment, you are essentially outsourcing a portion of your risk, yet the accountability remains firmly with your organization. This is where your risk assessment must account for the due diligence performed on partners, ensuring their security posture aligns with your internal standards. If you are drafting a risk profile, acknowledge that technical controls like encryption or pseudonymization are merely tools, not complete solutions for compliance. A truly robust approach involves mapping the physical and logical location of data, verifying that access controls are strictly applied based on the principle of least privilege, and confirming that deletion policies are actually enforced. When you understand the underlying dependency between the data, the process, and the technology, you can prioritize your mitigation efforts far more effectively than if you viewed privacy as an isolated legal silo. See you in our next session. Hello. It is good to see you again as we turn our attention toward the practical execution of risk assessments. Executing a risk assessment is not a theoretical exercise to be filed away in a drawer. It is the fundamental mechanism for ensuring that your compliance program addresses the actual threats facing your organization. When you begin this process, you must first foster an environment where colleagues feel comfortable expressing candid concerns about potential vulnerabilities. Many practitioners default to simple surveys, but a truly effective assessment requires a blend of methodologies, including one-on-one stakeholder interviews and deep dives into internal audit documentation. By examining data analytics alongside anecdotal evidence, you can create a more nuanced understanding of where the organization's processes might break down. You must carefully define the risk domains you are assessing, ranging from financial and operational risks to the more complex areas of strategic and reputational exposure. Maintaining a clear methodology for quantifying likelihood and impact allows you to move beyond gut feelings and into a structured, defensible framework. Velocity, while often overlooked, is a critical variable that measures how quickly a risk might manifest and impact operations, which is essential to prioritize your limited oversight resources effectively. Once you have gathered initial information, you need a way to organize these risks such that they inform management decision-making. The risk register serves as your master document, tracking each identified hazard, its owner, and the current state of internal controls designed to mitigate it. When mapping these onto a heat map, pay close attention to risks that fall into high-impact, high-likelihood quadrants, as these represent your most urgent priorities. You should also consider using bow-tie analysis to visualize both the causal paths leading to a risk and the consequence management measures intended to mitigate its impact. In the context of global operations, your assessment must scrutinize areas such as exposure to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or local anti-bribery laws, ensuring that geographic differences are acknowledged. If your company operates across jurisdictions with strict data privacy mandates like the GDPR or CCPA, these legal risks must be evaluated with the same rigor as financial controls. Do not forget to include third-party risks and broader macroeconomic factors, as regulatory enforcement trends shift rapidly and can catch a stagnant risk profile off guard. The value of an assessment is entirely determined by how the organization puts that information to work. You should view the assessment data as the primary driver for your audit planning, ensuring that your audit team spends their time testing the controls in high-risk areas rather than checking boxes on low-risk activities. Furthermore, the findings from your assessment should dictate your training curriculum, allowing you to create role-based programs that target the specific compliance gaps identified within different departments. Policy updates should not be static annual updates. They must be a direct response to the weaknesses uncovered in your risk register. If your assessment reveals a trend in ethics violations within sales, your policies, training, and monitoring priorities must shift to address that specific behavior immediately. This creates a feedback loop where the compliance program becomes dynamically responsive to your company's evolving business model, including shifts caused by mergers, acquisitions, or the introduction of new product lines. Static risk assessments become obsolete the moment they are finalized, so you must establish a protocol for dynamic updating. External factors, such as changes in OFAC economic sanctions lists or new interpretative guidance from regulatory bodies, can fundamentally alter your risk landscape overnight. Your role is to build a process that periodically probes these inputs, ensuring that the organization's risk profile remains a living document that reflects current realities. When you integrate these insights into the broader governance structure, you demonstrate to the board that compliance is not just a cost center, but an essential component of strategic planning. By aligning your assessment execution with the realities of day-to-day business operations, you move closer to a state where compliance is intentionally integrated into the culture rather than imposed from above. This analytical rigor ensures that you are prepared to defend your program design during audits or, more importantly, during a crisis where existing controls are tested. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we are going to explore how to effectively bridge the gap between completed risk assessments and operational compliance activity. Collecting assessment data is merely an academic exercise if that information does not directly inform your compliance strategy. Once you have identified inherent and residual risks through methods like stakeholder interviews, surveys, and quantitative data analytics, you possess a diagnostic tool that dictates where your limited budget and human resources are best deployed. Think of your risk register or heat map not as a static record, but as a dynamic roadmap for your compliance department. If your analysis indicates a high likelihood of a breach regarding the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act within your overseas sales division, your resource allocation should shift immediately to accommodate more rigorous internal controls in that region. Conversely, areas that present a low impact and low likelihood do not warrant an exhaustive level of monitoring, allowing you to optimize your organizational efficiency by focusing on what truly matters to the enterprise's viability. The data you aggregate serves as the primary input for your audit planning process. By understanding the velocity and impact of risks across domains such as regulatory compliance, operational safety, or reputational integrity, you can design a risk-based audit plan that cycles frequently through high-risk environments while maintaining a lighter touch elsewhere. This ensures that your auditors are not simply checking boxes, but are instead testing the specific internal controls designed to mitigate your most critical vulnerabilities. If the assessment shows fluctuating risks due to shifts in data privacy legislation, like the GDPR or CCPA, the audit plan must evolve synchronously to test for compliance with those specific changing mandates. This iterative feedback loop transforms audit findings into lessons learned, which subsequently feed back into your overall risk assessment model for the next cycle. Furthermore, this data is indispensable for tailoring your training curriculum to the specific needs of different employee cohorts. Broad, generic compliance training often leads to fatigue and disengagement because it may seem irrelevant to the day-to-day challenges faced by various departments. If your assessment data reveals that project managers are struggling with export controls or economic sanctions under OFAC guidelines, you can design role-based training that addresses these specific pain points directly. By referencing real-world outcomes from your assessments, you demonstrate to the workforce that compliance training is not just a mandatory requirement from headquarters, but an essential skill set required for their professional success. This data-driven approach fosters a culture of compliance that is grounded in the operational reality of the business rather than abstract legal theory. Finally, you must be prepared to update these risk profiles dynamically as the organization changes. Static risk assessments lose their utility within months because the business environment is inherently fluid. A merger with a new competitor, the launch of a product line in a different geography, or a sudden change in enforcement trends at the Department of Justice requires an immediate reassessment of your risk posture. When you integrate macroeconomic factors or shifting geopolitical landscapes into your ongoing risk analysis, you maintain the relevance of your ethics program. Use your existing assessment data as a baseline to measure the delta created by these new factors, and ensure your policies and SOPs reflect this new reality. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter regarding the design of role-based compliance programs. We will examine how to transition from generic training toward highly targeted, effective educational strategies. Building a robust compliance program often feels like a balancing act between broad organizational requirements and the specific needs of diverse business units. Many organizations fall into the trap of deploying blanket training that, while consistent, fails to resonate with employees who do not see its immediate application. By adopting a role-based structure, you shift the focus from check-the-box compliance to practical relevance, which is essentially the bedrock of a mature ethics program. This approach recognizes that an accountant, a software engineer, and a sales representative face fundamentally different ethical pressures and regulatory risks during their workday. When we design programs tailored to these functions, we are not just fulfilling a mandate, we are providing tools that employees can actually use to navigate their specific professional challenges. This relevance is the single most effective way to drive engagement and long-term retention of critical information. When we speak of role-based programs, we must categorize our curriculum based on the specific risk profiles inherent to different departments or hierarchies. For instance, employees in procurement or public-facing sales roles require intensive training on anti-bribery and corruption, including the nuances of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Conversely, staff in human resources or IT might require deeper training on data privacy and non-retaliation policies. This systematic segmentation allows you to increase the depth of content for those who need it most while avoiding unnecessary redundancy for others. You are effectively shifting the mindset from passive, universal compliance to active, context-aware decision-making. It requires a thorough analysis of job descriptions and existing risk assessments to determine exactly which roles possess the highest exposure to specific regulatory violations. To make this effective, you must integrate these curricula into the daily operations of the employees, rather than treating compliance as a separate, quarterly intervention. The content should address the code of conduct through the lens of real-world scenarios that mirror the actual tasks these individuals perform. For example, include simulations regarding conflicts of interest or insider trading that reflect the specific authority and access levels associated with those roles. This strategy also simplifies the process of tracking knowledge retention, as performance metrics can be aligned with the specific risks linked to those job categories. By focusing on practical application, you reduce the friction between compliance requirements and business velocity, which is often where the most significant gaps in organizational integrity emerge. Documentation remains a vital component of this design strategy, as you must be prepared to demonstrate the effectiveness of your education to regulators like the DOJ or the SEC. Your documentation should not merely confirm that an employee completed a module, but should also provide evidence of the comprehension levels and the specific curriculum they engaged with over time. Regulators look for proof that the training was adapted to the specific risks of the employee's role and that they were provided with sufficient knowledge to act ethically in their particular environment. If you cannot provide clear reports on which personnel underwent which specialized training, you leave your organization vulnerable during an investigation. Therefore, build your training platform to generate clear audit trails and attestation records that speak directly to the adequacy of your design. Finally, ensure that these role-based programs are integrated into your long-term communication strategy rather than existing in a vacuum. A sustainable program relies on ongoing dialogue, using formats like town halls or targeted messaging to reinforce the specialized training provided earlier in the cycle. This multi-channel approach ensures that the nuances of your compliance program remain top of mind for your employees regardless of their department. By aligning your communication strategy with the same role-based segmentation used in your training, you create a cohesive environment where the tone at the top is clearly understood at every level of the organization. This coherence is what distinguishes a functioning compliance program from one that is merely a document on a shelf. I look forward to our next discussion on learning principles. Welcome to this lesson on adult learning principles, where we will examine how to make compliance training actually work. We will focus on why standard instructional methods often fail in a corporate setting and how to pivot toward strategies that drive real behavioral change. When we talk about adult learning, or andragogy, we are moving away from the didactic model of schooling, where information is poured into a passive vessel. Adults come to the table as autonomous individuals with a wealth of experience, and any training that ignores this perspective is destined to be perceived as a waste of time. Your compliance training needs to be problem-centered rather than content-centered, because employees want to know how a regulation applies to their specific daily workflow. If you lead with abstract legal theory, you disconnect the professional from the core objective of understanding the risks they face in their specific roles. Instead, focus on the immediate, practical context by grounding every compliance concept in a tangible, real-world challenge. This relevance is the primary filter through which adults decide whether to invest their cognitive energy in what you are presenting. The principle of self-directedness is another cornerstone that we often overlook when deploying mass-scale compliance modules. An adult learner wants to understand the why behind a rule before they care about the how, and they want to exert some control over their learning path. This is why role-based training is so effective compared to a one-size-fits-all approach delivered to the entire company. When a salesperson understands that anti-bribery training is about preventing them from losing a contract or facing personal liability, the training suddenly transitions from a corporate hurdle to a protective mechanism. We should prioritize scenario-based learning where the trainee makes choices in a simulated environment that mirrors their actual work life. By testing their judgment in a low-risk environment, we allow them to build the muscle memory required for when true ethical dilemmas arise in the field. Microlearning is a tactical application of these principles that acknowledges the limited cognitive bandwidth of the modern professional. Rather than forcing employees to sit through an hour-long presentation on the entire code of conduct, we break complex topics into discrete, digestible units that focus on a single objective. Information density is high, but the duration is kept short to accommodate the interruptions and competing priorities inherent in any working day. This approach is particularly effective for reinforcing concepts like confidentiality, data privacy, or insider trading, where specific, actionable rules are more important than general theory. When we space these reinforcements out over time, we combat the forgetting curve that inevitably sets in after a single annual training session. Consistency over duration is not just a scheduling philosophy, but a cognitive strategy for ensuring long-term knowledge retention. Measuring effectiveness requires a transition from quantitative metrics like completion rates toward qualitative indicators of behavioral change. A 100% completion rate is a measure of compliance administration, not a measure of cultural competence or risk reduction. To truly assess if our adult learning principles are working, we must look at call volumes to the helpline or the quality of questions submitted to the ethics office following a training module. Focusing on these indicators tells us whether the material was understood and whether it gave the employee the confidence to voice concerns. We monitor the shift in culture by observing whether employees are moving toward proactive inquiries rather than reactive reporting after a violation has already occurred. This requires a feedback loop where we treat the training program as an evolving product that reacts to the realities of the business environment. Documentation becomes the final piece of this puzzle because, in the eyes of a regulator, an unproven training event is the same as no training at all. We must ensure that we have systems in place to verify not just that an employee launched a file, but that they engaged with the key learning outcomes and provided an attestation of understanding. This is crucial for demonstrating to the Department of Justice or other authorities that our compliance efforts are not just window dressing, but a fundamental part of the control environment. The goal is to prove that the organization intentionally designed its curriculum to educate, comprehend, and reinforce the necessary ethical standards. When we successfully document this, we transform a collection of training sessions into a robust, defensible pillar of the corporate compliance function. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this session, we investigate how to quantify the true impact of our compliance initiatives beyond mere attendance metrics. Measuring training effectiveness is an exercise in discerning the difference between activity and outcome. Most compliance programs fall into the trap of equating high completion rates with high levels of competence. While tracking who completed a module is a necessary administrative baseline, it tells you nothing about whether the employee actually understood the material or whether that knowledge has translated into ethical decision-making. To measure effectiveness, you must shift your perspective from quantitative reporting to qualitative assessment. This requires establishing a feedback loop that evaluates the cognitive absorption of the content, the change in observable behaviors, and the broader sentiment within the organization regarding compliance as a whole. Without this data, you are essentially flying blind, assuming that your design principles are landing as intended, while potentially missing critical gaps in understanding that could lead to future regulatory exposure. One of the most reliable methods for measuring retention is the use of pre- and post-training knowledge assessments. By establishing a baseline of understanding before a session and measuring it again immediately after, you can determine the direct value add of your training content. However, to truly measure long-term effectiveness, you should consider implementing spaced repetition testing or follow-up surveys that occur 30 or 60 days after the initial training event. This longitudinal approach reveals whether the information has been internalized or merely memorized for the sake of checking a box. When you observe that performance on specific subject matters, such as anti-bribery or conflict of interest declarations, fluctuates over time, you can pinpoint the exact areas of your curriculum that require reinforcement. This iterative feedback loop transforms your training strategy from a static requirement into a dynamic tool for cultural improvement. Behavioral change is the true north for any compliance program, and it requires looking at operational data rather than just training logs. For example, if you provide extensive training on data privacy and the proper handling of sensitive information, an effective program should be correlated with a reduction in reported data incidents over time. Similarly, analyze your helpline call volume not as a sign of trouble, but as a potential metric for training success. A well-trained workforce is often more aware of what constitutes a compliance issue, leading to a higher volume of reported concerns, which is a positive indicator of an engaged and vigilant culture. By correlating training metrics with employee feedback via anonymous culture surveys, you can identify discrepancies between what employees are taught and what they perceive to be the reality of the daily operational environment. Focus groups and direct managerial feedback are invaluable for uncovering the nuances that automated metrics often obscure. While quantitative data gives you the what, qualitative discussions and focus groups provide the why, allowing you to understand the friction points that prevent employees from applying compliance standards. Ask employees directly about their ability to navigate dilemmas, such as identifying potential insider trading situations or managing gift and hospitality restrictions in high-risk regions. When leadership participates in these dialogues, they not only gain insight into the effectiveness of the training, but also demonstrate a commitment to the process, which itself reinforces the desired cultural tone. This integrative approach ensures that your assessment methodologies are not just passive data gathering exercises, but active components of the compliance management cycle. Documenting these measurements is not just a best practice for internal improvement, it is a defensive necessity during regulatory scrutiny. When the DOJ or SEC evaluates the effectiveness of a corporate compliance program, they look for evidence that the organization is not only delivering education, but also analyzing its impact and refining the curriculum based on those findings. Your training documentation should therefore include not just completion certificates, but reports on assessment results, surveys of comprehension, and evidence of how you have adjusted your strategy in response to employee feedback. Proving that you are actively measuring, analyzing, and improving your training demonstrates to regulators that your program is a robust, well-funded reflection of active organizational oversight. A program that fails to measure its own effectiveness is one that regulators will eventually dismiss as mere paper compliance. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the mechanisms required to foster a robust culture of compliance within an organization. Building a culture of compliance is not merely an exercise in distributing documents or hosting annual seminars. It requires an intentional and sustained effort to weave ethical considerations into the daily decision-making fabric of every employee. When we consider the tone at the top, we are speaking about visible leadership commitment, but that is only the beginning. The middle management layer is equally critical, as these individuals often dictate the practical reality of how work is prioritized and how pressure is managed. If leadership rhetoric champions integrity but operational goals incentivize cutting corners, the culture will inevitably align with the incentives rather than the policies. Therefore, fostering culture requires a deliberate alignment between the stated ethical expectations and the practical business objectives that drive employee behavior. Communication acts as the primary vehicle for sustaining this cultural alignment. A multi-channel strategy ensures that compliance topics remain relevant throughout the year rather than appearing as isolated, once-a-year intrusions. Think of newsletters, town halls, and dedicated intranet portals as consistent nudges that reinforce the significance of ethical conduct. Leadership messaging should be specific and concrete, discussing real-world challenges rather than relying on abstract platitudes that employees tend to tune out. This consistent drumbeat of communication serves to normalize the discussion of ethics, making it as common as discussing sales targets or quarterly performance metrics. When communication is frequent and accessible, employees begin to view compliance as a professional standard of excellence rather than a bureaucratic hurdle to be cleared. Effective training programs must move away from the passive lecture model that has dominated corporate environments for decades. We know from adult learning principles that individuals retain information far better when they can apply it to their specific roles and see the potential consequences of their decisions. Role-based training allows us to move from generic legal jargon to specific scenarios that matter to a sales representative, a procurement officer, or an IT administrator. Microlearning, which focuses on concise, actionable segments, often proves more successful than hour-long sessions because it respects the time constraints of the workforce. By utilizing scenario-based segments, we force employees to navigate ethical dilemmas in a safe environment, which builds the muscle memory necessary for making tough choices in the heat of a real business crisis. Measuring the success of these cultural efforts requires us to look past simple completion statistics. While a report showing 99% completion of a training module might satisfy a check-the-box exercise, it tells us nothing about actual behavioral change or cultural health. To gain a clearer view, we must employ a mix of quantitative and qualitative data sources, such as detailed culture surveys that probe employee attitudes toward reporting misconduct. Analyzing the volume and quality of reports to the compliance hotline also provides a diagnostic view of whether the workforce trusts the internal system or fears retaliation. Focus groups and informal feedback loops are equally valuable, as they often uncover the subtle gaps between what we think our culture is and what employees experience on the front lines every day. We also cannot ignore the role of documentation in demonstrating the integrity of the program to regulators like the Department of Justice or the SEC. Proper documentation does more than prove adherence to training requirements. It provides evidence that the education provided was relevant, understood, and acknowledged by the recipient. A robust documentation strategy involves keeping records of the curriculum, including the specific topics covered such as anti-bribery, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, data privacy, and conflicts of interest. This documentation should also capture the results of comprehension assessments, ensuring that employees are not just attending sessions, but grasping the concepts. By maintaining a defensible trail, we provide the organization with the evidence required to show, in the event of an investigation, that the company took proactive steps to educate and guide its workforce. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the specific mechanics behind targeted communication strategies and how they function as a linchpin within your broader compliance framework. Effective communication in a compliance context is rarely about broadcasting a monolithic message to every employee across the company. Instead, it requires a nuanced approach where information is curated to match the specific risk profile and daily operational needs of the recipient. When we talk about targeting, we are essentially moving away from the static, one-size-fits-all periodic training email toward a dynamic flow of information that connects abstract legal requirements to the concrete reality of an employee's role. If you are communicating with your sales team, the messaging must emphasize practical outcomes related to high-risk areas like anti-bribery or conflict of interest in a way that resonates with their primary objective of closing business. Conversely, messaging meant for the finance department should focus heavily on data integrity, expense reporting, and the mechanisms of record keeping as required under the FCPA. This shift in perspective ensures that the content feels relevant rather than obstructive, which is the primary driver of actual message retention. By segmenting your audience and tailoring the communication style, you significantly reduce the noise that often plagues enterprise-wide administrative notices. Once you have identified the target groups, the choice of channel becomes the next critical variable in your strategy. Modern organizations rely on a multimodal approach because relying on a single channel, such as an annual seminar or a mass newsletter, almost always leads to a decline in engagement over time. You must consider the pulse of your organization, utilizing town halls for high-level ethical messaging and intranet portals or internal messaging platforms for immediate policy updates or compliance reminders. Leadership messaging, often referred to as the tone at the top, significantly benefits from these targeted channels because it establishes authenticity and consistency. If leadership comments on specific industry trends or ethical dilemmas relevant to a specific department, The workforce is far more likely to perceive the compliance program as a living, breathing component of their operational success. The effectiveness of these channels should not be based merely on reach, but on the ability of the medium to foster a dialogue rather than a monologue. When employees perceive that they have clear, accessible lanes to receive information, they are more engaged with the core ethical mission of the department. Documentation is the final mechanical piece of this strategy, and it is entirely centered on defensibility. If you cannot prove that specific information was delivered to the right people in a format they could comprehend, regulators will treat the communication as non-existent. This requires a robust system for tracking not just the consumption of training materials, but also the delivery of targeted messaging. You need to keep records of who received which notification, the date of that delivery, and, where possible, an attestation that the content was reviewed or understood. This is not merely an administrative checkbox, but a legal necessity if you ever need to demonstrate to the Department of Justice or the SEC that your program includes effective oversight and internal education. When you audit your own documentation, look for gaps where high-risk roles might have missed crucial updates on data privacy or insider trading. Maintaining this level of granular detail allows you to adjust your strategy based on evidence rather than intuition, ensuring that your program continuously improves its reach and efficacy. Your communication strategy is ultimately the public face of your compliance program, and it requires the same rigor as your financial reporting. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of the compliance landscape. Today, we are focusing specifically on the structural requirements of documentation within your training program. When we talk about training documentation, we are moving beyond the pedagogy of learning and entering the realm of legal defensibility. From the perspective of regulators like the DOJ, the SEC, or the OIG, a compliance program that exists only in oral tradition is essentially non-existent. Documentation serves as the tangible evidence that your organization has not only fulfilled its obligation to educate its workforce, but has also acted with due diligence to prevent misconduct. This requires a systematic approach to tracking who received what training, when they received it, and whether they understood the material. If a regulatory body audits your program, they will inevitably ask for proof that your employees were aware of their obligations under the FCPA, data privacy laws, or internal conflict of interest policies. Without rigorous records, you lack the primary defense needed to demonstrate that your organization's compliance efforts are proactive rather than reactive. A robust documentation strategy begins with the fundamental requirement of an audit trail for every training module delivered. You need a centralized system, typically integrated as part of a learning management system, that captures individual participant data, the date of completion, and the version of the course material accessed. It is insufficient to merely record that a training session occurred. You must document the specific content covered so that if a change in law occurs, you know exactly which employees were trained on the old standard versus the new one. This becomes critical when you are dealing with global policies or updates to the code of conduct. If a breach occurs, investigators will look for the specific notification or training acknowledgement that would have alerted that individual to the relevant rule. By automating these logs, you remove the variability of human error and ensure that your compliance department can generate real-time reports on coverage and gaps. Beyond simple completion logs, your strategy must include the documentation of content mastery through assessment results and attestation records. Passive training, such as watching a video without subsequent testing, carries significantly less weight in a legal context than an interactive module where the employee must demonstrate comprehension. Your system should store the specific scores achieved on quizzes or case study exercises, as this serves as evidence of an attempt to ensure the information was absorbed. Furthermore, digital attestations are a mandatory component of your documentation strategy. An attestation is a formal acknowledgement by the employee that they have read, understood, and agreed to abide by specific policies, such as an anti-bribery or whistleblower policy. By coupling this attestation with the date of training, you create a reinforced record that links the educational activity to the individual's commitment to compliance. The final aspect of documentation involves maintaining historical archives for the sake of long-term program evolution and trend analysis. You should consciously preserve records of training curricula, including slides, scripts, and handouts, even after they have been superseded by updated versions. This historical record allows you to demonstrate to regulators how your program has adapted to meet new risks and evolving operating environments over time. For example, if your organization faced an enforcement action 5 years ago, your archive documentation should show how the training content was adjusted to address those specific failures. This demonstrates institutional learning and a commitment to continuous improvement, which are highly valued by enforcement authorities. By maintaining this structured archive, you prove that your compliance program is a living, breathing component of your operations rather than a static document produced once a year to appease auditors. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will explore the mechanisms behind establishing internal controls, which act as the structural framework for any robust compliance and ethics program. Internal control is not merely a box-ticking exercise. It is the deliberate design of processes intended to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of objectives in operational effectiveness, reliable financial reporting, and compliance with applicable laws. At the core of this activity, we often look to the COSO framework as our North Star. This framework helps us categorize controls into preventative and detective measures, ensuring that we actively manage risk rather than merely reacting to it. When we talk about segregation of duties, we are essentially building a system where no single individual has the authority to execute, approve, and record a transaction in total isolation. This creates a natural friction that prevents unauthorized actions or accidental errors from cascading into systemic failures. Think of it as a defense in-depth strategy for your corporate ledger, where system access reviews serve as the gatekeeper, ensuring that only those with a legitimate business need can modify critical data. Without these logical barriers, your compliance program remains a paper-based aspiration rather than a lived organizational reality. Financial reconciliations are another pillar of internal controls that often go overlooked by those who view compliance solely as a matter of policy documents. When discrepancies emerge between your records and the actual financial state of your organization, that is not just an accounting error. It is a signal that your control environment may have been breached. By systematically validating these entries against source documentation, you are performing a functional audit of your internal integrity. If a vendor payment appears in your general ledger without an accompanying invoice or contract validation, your internal controls must trigger an immediate inquiry. This is precisely why we tie controls to a risk-based assessment. We want to ensure that our highest level of oversight is applied to the areas of most significant potential impact. When these controls are calibrated correctly, they act as the immune system for your organization, identifying and sequestering anomalies before they can propagate into reportable regulatory violations. Maturation of internal controls has shifted, moving toward an integrated model where technology plays a significant role in maintenance and oversight. Implementing controls is only half the battle if those controls are not revisited as the business landscape changes or as new regulatory pressures arrive. We see this in the application of data analytics, which allows for the continuous monitoring of transaction flows rather than waiting for an annual static audit. By embedding machine learning models or simple scripted trend analysis into your payroll or expense systems, you gain the ability to spot outliers that human reviewers might miss in a sea of data. A system that flags an unusually large payment to a vendor just hours after that vendor was onboarded is a perfect example of a detective control working as intended. While technology does not replace the need for professional judgment, it certainly amplifies your reach, allowing you to focus your limited resources on verifying the most suspicious data points rather than spending time on clean, routine, and low-risk transactions. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we examine how modern compliance programs move beyond periodic, retrospective checks toward a model of persistent oversight. Implementing continuous monitoring is a structural shift in how we gain assurance regarding the efficacy of our compliance and ethics program. While traditional audits often function as a snapshot in time, continuous monitoring operates as a constant feedback loop that verifies our controls remain active and effective. The core objective is to move from reactive investigations after a failure has occurred to proactive, real-time detection of potential misconduct. Organizations that successfully transition to this model leverage their internal data architectures to flag irregularities as they happen, rather than waiting for an annual review cycle. This requires a fundamental integration between the compliance department and the IT or internal audit functions to ensure data streams are both reliable and accessible. By treating compliance data as a live asset, we can identify gaps in segregation of duties or unauthorized access attempts before they manifest as regulatory breaches. The technological backbone of this approach relies on leveraging data analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning models. Instead of manually reviewing a sample of expense reports or payroll entries, automated systems scan the entire population of transactions for predefined anomalies. For instance, a machine learning algorithm might identify a vendor payment that deviates from standard procurement patterns, such as a disbursement split into small increments just below a formal approval threshold. These tools also allow for real-time analysis of the general ledger, helping to highlight suspicious journal entries that could indicate accounting improprieties or bribery risks. Furthermore, these systems are particularly adept at cross-referencing multiple disparate databases to create a holistic view of user activity across separate enterprise resource planning platforms. By automating the identification of red flags, we enable compliance officers to focus their scarce human capital on investigating high-risk events rather than sifting through thousands of benign transactions. To make this data meaningful, you must distill raw output into actionable reporting through key performance indicators and key risk indicators. A dashboard approach is essential here, as it allows the board of directors and senior management to visualize the health of the compliance program at a glance. Key performance indicators might track the percentage of employees who have completed periodic certifications or the average time taken to remediate an identified control gap. Conversely, key risk indicators provide early warning signs, such as an increase in reported travel expenses in a high-risk jurisdiction or a spike in unauthorized access attempts to sensitive customer databases. When these metrics are presented clearly, they facilitate informed decision-making and demonstrate to stakeholders that the organization possesses a verifiable, objective understanding of its own risk environment. This process turns the abstract concept of compliance into a structured discipline that is measurable and subject to continuous improvement. Finally, the value of continuous monitoring is only realized when the findings drive a rigorous continuous improvement cycle. An audit finding should never be viewed as a standalone event. Rather, it functions as a trigger for a deeper root cause analysis to understand why a control failed or was circumvented. Once the underlying issue is identified, the response must include corrective actions, such as updating internal policies, enhancing specific training modules, or reconfiguring system permissions to prevent recurrence. This closing of the loop transforms the compliance program into a resilient structure that learns from its own challenges. By consistently analyzing these outcomes, an organization strengthens its ethical posture and builds a defense against the varied legal and regulatory pressures it faces. This iterative nature ensures that your compliance program remains as dynamic as the operating environment itself. I will see you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. Today, we are turning our attention toward the practical mechanics of designing robust audit plans. We will explore how to translate high-level risk assessments into actionable oversight strategies that verify your compliance program is not merely a document on a shelf, but a functional reality within your business environment. A well-designed audit plan acts as the connective tissue between your identified risks and the actual verification of control effectiveness. When we speak about designing these plans, we are primarily concerned with operationalizing the risk-based approach you have defined elsewhere in your compliance framework. The fundamental objective is to provide objective assurance that the internal controls, which you have previously put in place, are functioning exactly as intended when they were designed. You must approach this with a clear understanding that an audit is not an exercise in finding someone to blame, but rather a systematic methodology for identifying where the process might experience failure or where human intervention might bypass existing safeguards. To achieve this, your plan must be inherently independent and free from the conflicting interests of the departments being reviewed, ensuring that your findings carry the weight of impartiality. When we construct the structure of an audit, we shift our focus towards specific testing protocols that map back to the highest risk areas of the organization. If, for instance, your risk assessment has flagged procurement as a high-risk area for bribery, Your audit plan should explicitly include detailed transaction testing, sample-based document reviews, and process walkthroughs within that specific department. You need to consider how you define the scope of your audit, ensuring it is broad enough to catch systemic issues, yet narrow enough to be executed with the resources available to your team. A significant portion of this design phase involves defining the sampling methodology. You must decide whether a statistical random sample or a judgmental sample based on high-risk indicators is more appropriate for the dataset. By documenting these design decisions, you create a defensible record of your due diligence, which is vital if you are ever called upon to justify your program's oversight mechanism to regulatory bodies. The effectiveness of your audit plan relies heavily on your ability to integrate continuous monitoring mechanisms that feed back into the audit schedule. While traditional audits are often cyclical or scheduled annually, a modern compliance audit plan should be dynamic enough to incorporate data-driven triggers. When you embed continuous monitoring for transactions like vendor payments or payroll adjustments, you effectively lower the burden of manual audits for low-risk, high-volume activities. This allows your audit plan to reallocate valuable resources toward more complex or higher-risk areas that require qualitative evaluation rather than mere data matching. You are essentially designing an ecosystem where the audit plan is updated based on the insights gained from ongoing monitoring, which creates a more responsive and agile compliance posture. Finally, we must integrate the feedback loop into the architectural design of the audit plan to ensure long-term organizational health. An audit that produces reports but fails to facilitate remedial action is fundamentally broken, as it provides no value to the business and misses the point of control verification. When designing your audit plan, create clearly defined workflows for escalation and root cause analysis that start the moment an anomaly is detected. You should establish how findings will be communicated to the board of directors and executive management, as these stakeholders require summarized, high-level reporting rather than overwhelming granular detail. By ensuring that every finding is linked to an identified risk exposure and a clear, time-bound corrective action, you transition the audit function from a defensive posture to a strategic partner in organizational resilience. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and today we turn our attention to the practical execution of audits within a compliance and ethics program. This phase is where theoretical safeguards meet the reality of day-to-day organizational operations. Executing an audit is far more than a simple checklist exercise. It is a systematic verification process that tests whether your internal controls are operating as designed. When you enter the fieldwork phase, you must focus on obtaining objective evidence through techniques like process walkthroughs, where you observe step-by-step procedures to ensure they match documented policies. Sampling is an equally vital component here, as you cannot review every single transaction in a large corporation. By selecting a statistically significant sample of transactions, you gain a reasonable assurance that the population, be it expense reports, vendor payments, or general ledger entries, is free from material misstatements or compliance breaches. Remember that these methods must remain anchored in your risk-based plan to ensure you are spending your auditing resources on the areas of greatest exposure to the organization. Document review serves as the backbone of your evidence gathering during this execution phase. You are looking for proof that approvals, authorizations, and reconciliations are actually taking place and are not just rubber-stamped entries in a system. When auditing financial reconciliations or system access reviews, you should pay close attention to segregation of duties to ensure no single individual holds excessive control over a high-risk process. If you find discrepancies, your duty is to document them thoroughly, noting the deviation from the established control and gathering the necessary context to determine if it stems from a systemic flaw or an isolated mistake. This evidence becomes the data set you will later use for root cause analysis. So precision is non-negotiable at this stage. You are acting as a scientist of sorts, gathering observations that will eventually describe the health of the entire compliance ecosystem. Independence and objectivity remain the guiding principles throughout your fieldwork. While you are interacting with various departments, you must maintain a professional distance to ensure that your findings are not skewed by internal pressures or operational convenience. As you perform your walkthroughs and interviews, be empathetic but firm in your requirement for supporting documentation. If an interviewee claims a process works a certain way, ask them to show you the evidence in the system or the paper trail. This requires a firm grasp of the COSO framework, as you need to know exactly which control is being tested and what the existence of an artifact signifies for the overall integrity of the control environment. If your execution lacks this rigor, the resulting reports will fail to provide the board or senior management with the assurance they require to govern the enterprise effectively. Effective execution also means being prepared for the complexity that modern technological environments bring to auditing. Since many controls are now automated within ERP systems or cloud-based platforms, you must understand how to access and interpret system logs and configuration settings. You are not just looking at spreadsheets anymore. You are looking at data extracted via analytical tools that might highlight anomalies, such as duplicate payments or unauthorized access attempts. This shift toward technical proficiency requires that you speak the language of the IT and finance departments. By integrating these technical checks into your standard fieldwork, you move beyond tick box compliance and into the realm of true operational assurance. The success of your audit program ultimately rests on your ability to verify that what the organization says it does is in fact what is happening on the ground. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to a new lecture, where we pivot from the execution of audits to the sophisticated task of interpreting the data we collect. In the landscape of modern compliance, the ability to synthesize raw data into meaningful intelligence is perhaps the most significant differentiator between a program that merely checks boxes and one that drives genuine organizational change. We often find ourselves drowning in logs, transaction reports, and survey results, yet struggle to articulate what this information actually tells us about our ethical posture. The transition from raw data to actionable insight requires a structured approach that moves beyond simple spreadsheet aggregation. By focusing on the transformation of isolated data points into cohesive key performance indicators and key risk indicators, we provide the board and management with a narrative that is both measurable and defensible. This process is not about accumulating more numbers. It is about establishing a signal-to-noise ratio that allows us to identify genuine threats before they manifest as regulatory breaches. When we speak of key performance indicators, we are discussing the health and activity levels of the program, such as the percentage of employees who have completed core training or the average elapsed time between the submission of a report and its initial intake. Conversely, key risk indicators serve as predictive sensors, often highlighting shifts in the underlying environment that might necessitate a change in our compliance strategy. For example, a spike in expense reimbursement requests that fall just beneath the threshold for manager approval could indicate a systemic attempt to bypass internal controls, even if no individual violation on its own warrants a formal investigation. By tracking these metrics over consistent intervals, we move from a reactive posture to a proactive one, allowing us to see patterns in how business units interact with policy. Maintaining a dashboard is essentially about creating a high-level view that translates technical compliance jargon into language that executive leadership and board members can use to make informed decisions. Effective analysis also demands a high degree of context, as numbers without an underlying operational environment are often misleading. If your data indicates that a specific region has significantly lower report numbers for potential fraud, you must investigate whether this represents a triumph of ethical behavior or a breakdown in local reporting channels. This is where qualitative insights must intersect with quantitative metrics, as the primary goal of our documentation is to reveal the story hiding behind the figures. We must consider the business environment, market pressures, and even cultural nuances when determining whether a dashboard reading is a positive indicator of compliance or a sign of an inhibited reporting culture. When you present these findings, your objective must always be to connect the metrics to the broader goals of the organization, demonstrating exactly how compliance initiatives contribute to the longevity and profitability of the company. Transparency in these metrics is just as vital as the accuracy of the reporting, as stakeholders will frequently challenge the validity of our conclusions. You need to be prepared to defend the methodology used to derive your indicators, which implies that your definitions must be consistent across the entire enterprise. If one department defines a training completion rate based on active employees, and another includes every individual who has ever had a login, your reports will be inherently flawed. and logically inconsistent. Standardization ensures that the metrics are comparable over time and across different global business units, which is essential for identifying which parts of the organization are improving and which are not. Ultimately, if your audience cannot follow the logic from the raw source material to the displayed indicator, the trust you have built with the board will quickly evaporate. Finally, remember that the goal of this analytical rigor is to foster a cycle of continuous improvement that strengthens our defenses over time. If a metric persistently highlights an area of recurring policy violation, the data is essentially guiding your next set of training interventions or control adjustments. We are using these metrics not to punish, but to iterate and adapt our programs in alignment with the changing risk profile of the organization. As you continue to refine these reporting mechanisms, keep in mind that the best dashboard is one that is used frequently for decision-making rather than one that is simply filed away following a routine compliance report. Every metric you include should serve a specific purpose in evaluating whether we are truly mitigating risk or merely performing the motions of oversight. I look forward to our next discussion as we delve deeper into these professional responsibilities. Welcome to our discussion on the continuous improvement cycle, a critical mechanism for maintaining the integrity and efficacy of any compliance program. We will examine how audit outcomes act as the catalyst for systemic evolution rather than mere documentation exercises. Building a robust compliance program is not a linear activity that concludes once policies are drafted and distributed to employees. Instead, it functions as a feedback loop where audit findings serve as primary inputs for organizational learning and structural refinement. When your monitoring activities or internal audits identify a control deficiency, the objective is to move beyond temporary patches. This process begins with a rigorous root cause analysis, which seeks to understand why a control failed or why a policy was circumvented in the first place. Was the policy unclear? Was the training insufficient? Or perhaps was the business process intentionally designed to bypass compliance checkpoints to favor expediency? Addressing the symptom without identifying the underlying cause ensures the eventual recurrence of the same compliance failure. Once the root cause is established, the cycle moves toward implementing targeted corrective actions that effectively close the observed control gap. This often involves updating internal policies to reflect changing regulatory requirements or operational realities, but it also extends to refining training programs to address specific knowledge gaps identified during testing. If an audit reveals that a specific department consistently fails to perform mandatory peer reviews on vendor payments, simply demanding better compliance is ineffective. A continuous improvement approach might prompt an automated system block in the ERP when a review is missing, or it might initiate specialized scenario-based training for that specific team. By linking an identified vulnerability to a concrete change in business operations, you create an adaptive environment that naturally resists the degradation of ethics standards over time. This cycle relies heavily on the integration of data-driven insights gathered through your ongoing audit and monitoring efforts. As you gather data on policy adherence and control effectiveness, you should be mapping these metrics against your established baseline to measure organizational resilience. Metrics like the time taken to remediate an audit finding or the recurrence rate of specific compliance nonconformities provide a clear view of how effectively your loop is closing. If you find that the same issues appear in reports year after year, your improvement cycle is broken, and the organization remains exposed to legal or regulatory failures. Transparency with the board of directors is essential here, as they require evidence that identified risks are being mitigated through this structured process of evaluation and adjustment. Ultimately, the goal is to transform the compliance function from a static cost center into a strategic partner that strengthens the organization. Continuous improvement forces an honest look at the state of internal controls and encourages management to treat ethics failures as opportunities for process innovation. When leadership recognizes that audit findings are not attacks on their departments, but necessary navigational corrections, the organizational culture begins to shift. This systemic resilience is exactly what regulators look for. They are less concerned with a program that claims perfection and far more interested in a program that can demonstrate its ability to find, fix, and prevent its own mistakes. You are not just closing loops on individual reports. You are hardening the entire framework against future volatility. I look forward to seeing you in our next lecture. Welcome. Let us discuss how to implement anonymous reporting systems and the essential infrastructure behind them. An anonymous hotline represents a non-negotiable component of a robust corporate compliance program. When we consider the mechanics of internal reporting, the primary objective is to lower the barrier for employees to surface misconduct without fear of retribution. Whether this is handled through a third-party service provider or an internal web portal, the system must facilitate a secure flow of information from the reporter to the compliance department while maintaining total confidentiality. This is not merely an administrative checkbox. It is a structural necessity mandated by federal regulations such as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. If a whistleblower suspects their identity will be revealed, they will remain silent. And that silence usually conceals the very risks the board needs to know about. Designing these systems requires a careful balance between accessibility and security. You might choose to implement a toll-free telephone number staffed by external operators who can provide multilingual support, as this removes the potential for internal bias during the initial intake. Alternatively, a web-based reporting form allows the user to attach documents and evidence, which drastically improves the quality of information provided to investigators. Regardless of the technical medium, the intake process must ensure that the reporter receives a unique identifier so they can track the status of their report without ever needing to disclose a name. It is a technical design choice that directly impacts the psychological safety of the entire organization. Consider a scenario where an employee observes a small-scale vendor fraud initiated by a department manager. If the employee perceives the hotline as untrustworthy or connected to the manager's inner circle, they will prioritize their own job security over the organization's integrity. By routing anonymous reports through a third party, you create a neutral buffer that prevents an individual manager from knowing who complained or intercepting the information before it reaches the compliance office. This infrastructure does not exist in isolation, as it must be integrated with your broader incident management workflow. When a report arrives, it triggers a triage process where compliance officers assess the urgency and potential regulatory impact, ensuring that serious allegations like corruption or safety violations are addressed immediately. Compliance professionals must also recognize the limits of anonymity. An anonymous report is often just the beginning of a larger discovery process, requiring the same level of objective, professional scrutiny as a named report. Data gathered through these channels must be encrypted in transit and at rest to comply with international privacy standards, which are increasingly stringent in jurisdictions like the European Union. You are responsible for ensuring that the vendor managing your hotline understands these requirements, especially regarding how long records are stored and who has access to them. The ultimate value of a hotline isn't just that it collects complaints. It is that it generates a consistent trail of data that helps you identify systemic weaknesses in the organizational culture or internal controls. If an investigation follows a report, the documentation process must remain strictly isolated from day-to-day employee files. Protecting the identity of a reporter is not just about ethics. It is a legal requirement that keeps your program defensible against claims of constructive discharge or retaliation. When you present this data to the board or the audit committee, always focus on the patterns observed over time rather than the specific details of individual reporters. By providing this aggregate view, you help leadership understand the health of the company without exposing individual vulnerabilities. This level of rigor elevates your role from a reactive investigator to a proactive architect of organizational integrity. I look forward to our next session together. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the critical framework of non-retaliation policies and why they are essential for a functional compliance program. A robust compliance program relies entirely on the willingness of people to speak up when they observe misconduct. If employees fear that reporting a concern will result in professional marginalization, demotion, or termination, they will inevitably remain silent. This silence creates a blind spot for the organization, allowing risks to fester until they escalate into a crisis. Therefore, a non-retaliation policy is not merely a legal checkbox. It is the practical foundation of an ethical culture. It signals to the workforce that the organization prioritizes integrity over the protection of individuals who violate policy. By codifying protections for whistleblowers, a company actively works to lower the barriers to reporting. This encourages early detection, which is almost always less costly and less disruptive than identifying misconduct after it has become a full-scale legal or public relations failure. The legislative landscape surrounding non-retaliation has evolved significantly, particularly with the introduction of regulations like the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Dodd-Frank Act, and various OSHA provisions. These laws mandate that organizations must provide clear protections for individuals who report fraud or safety violations. However, compliance professionals must understand that a policy is only as effective as its enforcement. When a report is made, the organization must actively monitor the reporter's professional circumstances to ensure no adverse employment action follows. This requires constant vigilance from the compliance department to ensure that managers do not engage in subtle forms of retaliation. Subtle acts, such as being excluded from meetings, receiving unfair performance reviews, or being bypassed for promotions, can be just as damaging to a reporting culture as overt firing. Effective policy implementation requires that we clearly define what constitutes prohibited retaliation and what constitutes legitimate business decisions. It is common for a manager to express concern that a poor-performing employee might attempt to use a whistleblower complaint as a shield against termination. To mitigate this tension, compliance officers must work closely with human resources to ensure that every employment decision after a report is documented with neutral, performance-based evidence. If an employee was already on a documented performance improvement plan before they made a disclosure, the organization has a clear administrative record. Without such documentation, any subsequent disciplinary action will naturally be scrutinized under the assumption of retaliation. Therefore, the goal is to create a process where the truth of the situation is self-evident to any objective reviewer. Communication is the glue that holds these policies together, as employees must know that these protections exist and that they are actually upheld. Simply placing a policy in an employee handbook is insufficient if the organization has created a culture where people believe that management circles the wagons to protect itself. To combat this, leaders must be transparent about the fact that investigations take place and that the organization respects the privacy and safety of those who report. Providing multiple channels for reporting, such as anonymous hotlines or web portals, is a step in the right direction. But these channels only work if the follow-up process is credible. When an employee sees that a report led to a tangible change or a fair resolution without the reporter suffering consequences, trust increases. Conversely, one high-profile incident where a whistleblower is publicly shamed will undo years of investment in compliance training. Developing a non-retaliation culture ultimately shifts the internal dynamic from one of fear to one of accountability. When employees recognize that they are partners in maintaining the company's integrity, they are far more likely to raise concerns before those issues cause systemic harm. This requires the compliance function to remain independent and objective, ensuring that reports are routed to the proper investigative teams without interference. If the investigation processes are shielded from the influence of those who might be the subjects of a report, the integrity of the entire system remains intact. Compliance professionals spend a considerable amount of time building these technical frameworks, but the real test is the daily interaction between staff and management. By prioritizing these protections, you are creating an environment where risks are identified, managed, and mitigated before they threaten the organization's viability. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on internal investigations, where we will examine the structured approach needed to uncover and address organizational misconduct. We will cover the life cycle of an investigation, including planning, execution, and the legal considerations that ensure your findings are defensible. Conducting an internal investigation is a high-stakes endeavor that requires a balance between speed, thoroughness, and legal protection. When a report of misconduct surfaces through your hotlines or reporting channels, the immediate priority is to conduct a professional triage process. You must assess the allegation to determine the scope of the investigation, the specific laws or policies potentially violated, and the level of sensitivity involved. Failure to act promptly can lead to the destruction of evidence or the escalation of illicit activities. So your intake process needs a refined, repeatable workflow. You should assemble a team that is not only competent, but also independent from the business units being investigated to avoid conflicts of interest. This team often requires a cross-functional blend of expertise, pulling from legal, human resources, compliance, and internal audit as dictated by the nature of the issue. A common mistake is failing to document the initial triage decisions, which can later be interpreted as bias or an attempt to suppress findings. Reliability in your process stems from the methodical adherence to a predetermined plan rather than reactive ad hoc maneuvers. By remaining objective through the planning phase, you establish the foundation of a credible investigation that withstands external scrutiny. Once your team is assembled, the investigative strategy must account for the legal nuances that protect the organization and its employees during the process. One of the most critical elements here is the Upjohn warning, often referred to as the corporate Miranda warning. You must clearly explain to any employee being interviewed that you represent the corporation and not the individual, meaning the attorney-client privilege belongs to the company alone. This distinction is vital because it manages the interviewee's expectations regarding confidentiality, which the company may waive at its own discretion later. In practice, seasoned investigators use the funnel approach, moving from broad, open-ended questions to more specific, fact-based inquiries to ensure they capture the full narrative without inadvertently influencing the witness's testimony. Active listening is not just a soft skill. It is a technical tool that allows you to identify inconsistencies or gaps in the employee's timeline. You should also be prepared to employ cognitive interviewing techniques that help witnesses recall specific environmental or sensory details without the use of leading questions. Consistency is your primary goal, as standardized interview procedures protect the integrity of the collected testimony, making it impervious to claims of coercion or manipulation. After the interviews and data collection phases are complete, your focus must shift to the rigorous documentation of your findings. An investigation report needs to be entirely factual, objective, and devoid of speculative or emotional language that could undermine the gravity of the conclusions. You are essentially building a case file that should survive the scrutiny of regulators or external counsel years after the original event. This means ensuring that every conclusion is anchored to specific evidence, whether that is digital forensics, email logs, or transcribed statements. To maintain the integrity of these documents, it is standard practice to treat the investigation file as attorney work product to the extent possible. This strategy requires the active involvement of legal counsel from the outset, as they must direct the investigative process to justify the claim of privilege. If the investigation happens without this legal nexus, you risk losing the protection of those communications during subsequent discovery phases in litigation. Protecting this work product is not about hiding the truth, but about ensuring that the deliberative process remains confidential while the organization weighs its legal and regulatory options. The conclusion of the investigative report should naturally lead into the post-investigation phase, specifically focusing on accountability and systemic improvement. If misconduct is confirmed, your organization must apply disciplinary actions in a consistent manner, regardless of the seniority or performance tier of the individuals involved. This is where your non-retaliation policy faces its ultimate test. Any evidence of retaliation against whistleblowers or cooperative employees must be treated as a separate, severe infraction. Beyond individual accountability, you must perform a thorough root cause analysis to determine why the policy or control failed in the first place. This allows you to develop concrete remediation plans that go beyond simple training updates, perhaps modifying workflows or adding technical controls that prevent identical issues from recurring. Transparency in these outcomes, while maintaining the confidentiality of the specific personnel involved, can actually reinforce a strong ethical culture across the organization. Following the investigation, the lessons learned should be integrated back into your risk assessment process, feeding the continuous improvement cycle that keeps a compliance program relevant. Your goal is to move the organization from a reactive state to a proactive environment where lessons from every investigation are leveraged to harden the company's internal controls. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we move beyond the mechanical aspects of reporting to explore the nuances of advanced interviewing techniques required for effective internal investigations. When we sit down to conduct an interview during an internal investigation, we must first recognize that the environment is inherently stressful for the interviewee. The funnel approach is a standard, effective method that starts with broad, open-ended questions before narrowing down to specific, critical details. You begin by asking an employee to describe their role, their daily processes, or their understanding of a specific project, which allows them to speak freely and naturally. As the conversation progresses, you gradually focus on the period in question or the specific incident being investigated. This technique prevents the interviewee from feeling interrogated immediately, which often lowers defenses and yields more authentic, less rehearsed information. By the time you reach the sensitive queries, you have already established a factual baseline against which you can verify their later responses. Active listening is perhaps the most undervalued tool in a compliance professional's repertoire because it requires us to set aside our own agenda for a moment and truly engage with the interviewee. This means paying attention not just to the words spoken, but to the nonverbal cues, the hesitation in their voice, and the internal consistency of their narrative. When an interviewee provides an answer, reflect that information back to them to ensure clarity, which signals that you are tracking their account accurately. If there is a contradiction in their testimony, do not immediately challenge it with hostility, as this invites defensiveness. Instead, ask them to reconcile the discrepancy. An investigative interview is a search for the truth, not a debate, and active listening keeps the participants focused on providing facts rather than justifying their actions. Cognitive interviewing introduces a layer of psychological precision by encouraging the interviewee to mentally reconstruct the context of an event. You can ask them to describe the physical environment, their emotional state at the time, or the sequence of events in reverse order, which is a technique designed to trigger deeper memory retrieval. When people recount events, they often rely on scripts or surface-level summaries. By asking them to recall specific peripheral details, you disrupt that cognitive shortcut. This method makes it significantly more difficult for an interviewee to maintain a fabricated story, as lies require immense mental effort to keep consistent when the prompt for details becomes increasingly specific. It also helps the interviewee remember details they might have previously considered irrelevant, but turn out to be vital to the investigation. A critical juncture in any corporate interview is the issuance of the Upjohn warning, which is the institutional equivalent of a Miranda warning. You must clearly and unequivocally state that you are conducting the investigation on behalf of the company, that the legal privilege belongs to the company, and that the company reserves the right to waive that privilege at its sole discretion. Too often, employees mistakenly assume that the compliance officer or the external investigator is their personal attorney, leading to a false sense of confidentiality. The Upjohn warning explicitly clarifies that information shared during the interview can be disclosed to third parties, such as regulators or law enforcement, if the organization deems it necessary. Ensuring the employee understands this distinction early on protects the integrity of the attorney-client privilege moving forward. The environment of the interview must be controlled and professional to maintain the sanctity of the investigation process. If you are conducting the interview alongside HR or an external auditor, ensure that each participant's role is defined before entering the room. Documentation is paramount. You should have someone designated to keep contemporaneous, accurate notes, as the quality of your eventual report will depend entirely on this primary data. If the interviewee is a whistleblower or a potential target, be mindful of the physical setting to ensure they feel safe enough to speak, but remain focused on the task. The goal is to create a setting where facts are separated from the surrounding noise, enabling a clean, objective, and defensible record of what transpired. I look forward to discussing how these interviews shape your broader investigative reports in our next session together. Welcome back to our exploration of the reporting and investigation function within a compliance program. When we transition from the active phase of an internal investigation to the finalization phase, the quality of our documentation becomes the primary artifact of our integrity. You must approach the task of writing an investigation report with the mindset of building an objective record that could withstand scrutiny from regulators, internal audit, or an outside counsel years after the original events occurred. Every statement must be grounded in primary evidence, such as financial records, email archives, or corroborated interview notes, rather than anecdotal observations or professional opinions. If you find yourself tempted to include conjecture about a subject's state of mind, you must pull back and focus strictly on observable behavior and documented outcomes. This discipline is not merely about bureaucratic form, but about ensuring that the organization can justify its remediation steps if the investigation outcome is eventually questioned in a court of law. Clear documentation clarifies the timeline while highlighting the specific internal controls that failed or were circumvented. It serves as the bedrock for any disciplinary or remedial action the company decides to take later. By maintaining this high level of factual rigor, you demonstrate that the compliance team functioned with independence and that the investigation was not a sham process. A well-structured investigation report should typically begin with a clear, concise scope statement that defines precisely what the investigation covered and what was outside its jurisdiction. This sets the boundary and manages the expectations of stakeholders who may be reading this report with different objectives in mind. You should describe the investigative team involved, ensuring that the roles of internal departments like HR, legal, or external forensic accountants are clearly defined. The main body of the report ought to map out the investigative actions taken in chronological order, starting from the initial report or discovery of the matter through the conclusion of the fact-finding phase. When referencing interviews, summarize the findings accurately while clearly distinguishing between personal recollections of witnesses and confirmed documentary evidence. If you utilize the work product doctrine to protect the confidentiality of the report, ensure that the document has been prepared at the direction of legal counsel, as courts generally only protect documents that were prepared in anticipation of litigation. This framing is essential to prevent unintended discovery during subsequent legal proceedings. Always remember that, despite your efforts to maintain privilege, you must write the report as if it could eventually be shared with regulators, as privilege can sometimes be waived or successfully challenged. Once the factual findings are solidified, the report should transition logically into a summary of conclusions based on the evidence presented. It is critical that your conclusions follow directly from the facts you have documented earlier in the document, avoiding any leap of logic that might appear biased. From an organizational perspective, your writing needs to be comprehensive enough to explain the root cause of the incident to senior management, which is often the first step in the remediation process. If systemic weaknesses in current business processes were identified, articulate them clearly rather than just focusing on the individual conduct of the employees involved. This helps the organization move toward a constructive response, such as adjusting the code of conduct or implementing new automated monitorings of transaction feeds. Your report must avoid making legally binding determinations if you are not an attorney, as that is a task for legal counsel. Instead, you focus on providing the raw material that allows leadership to make informed decisions regarding discipline or policy changes. By keeping your analysis centered on the facts and the process flaws, you minimize the risk of defamation claims or allegations of an unfair internal disciplinary process. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the tactical nuances of managing client privilege within the scope of corporate internal investigations. When we initiate an internal investigation, the primary objective is to seek the truth, but we must do so under a protective shield of legal privilege. Attorney-client privilege is not a blanket immunity that covers every conversation within an office, but rather a specific legal doctrine designed to protect confidential communications between a client and their lawyer for the purpose of seeking or providing legal advice. In the corporate context, the client is the organization itself, represented by the board and senior leadership, rather than individual employees or managers. When you hire external counsel to lead or supervise an investigation, you are essentially creating a firewall that helps keep sensitive findings shielded from discovery and future litigation. Without this deliberate structure, your interview notes, internal memos, and preliminary reports could be subpoenaed and used against the company in court. It is therefore vital that the legal department remains the primary client throughout the engagement to maintain the integrity of that privilege. To rely on this protection, every step of the investigative process must be clearly demarcated as being conducted under the direction of counsel. When you assemble a team to investigate a potential ethics breach, the investigators should ideally report to the legal department rather than purely to human resources or business operations. This distinction is subtle but legally critical because it signals that the investigation is conducted to provide legal advice, not just to conduct a standard business process. You must also exercise extreme caution when preparing documents, as not every internal email mentioning an investigation constitutes privileged work product. Every document created during the process should be clearly marked as confidential and prepared at the request of counsel for the purpose of legal analysis. When investigators talk to employees, they must clearly articulate the limits of the conversation to ensure that the privilege remains intact and that employees do not labor under the misconception that the lawyer represents them personally. We frequently use what is known as the Upjohn warning, named after a seminal Supreme Court case, to clarify this relationship to the employee being interviewed. By delivering this warning, the investigator explains that the attorney represents the company and that the company, not the employee, holds the privilege and has the sole authority to waive it. This prevents an employee from later claiming that they believe their conversations with the legal team were confidential and immune from disclosure, which could inadvertently lead to a claim of shared privilege. You must ensure that these warnings are delivered consistently before any investigative interview occurs. If you neglect this step, you risk a scenario where an employee's statements are inadvertently exposed, or worse, where the entire privilege status of the investigation is challenged in court. Maintaining this barrier is a constant, deliberate effort that demands rigorous discipline from every member of your team. Documentation also plays a major role in the preservation or destruction of your legal privilege. While we aim to be factual, your reports must balance the need for accuracy with the protective requirements of the work product doctrine. If you draft a memo that is purely administrative and lacking an underlying legal purpose, it likely will not qualify for protection regardless of who drafted it. Your documentation should focus on the facts gathered and the legal assessment provided by counsel, rather than speculative commentary or unauthorized opinions. By keeping the document focused on the legal strategy and the company's risk posture, you improve your ability to argue that these records are litigation work product. If you fail to separate administrative tasks from these protected efforts, you expose the company's internal deliberations to public scrutiny during lawsuits or regulatory investigations. Finally, managing the intersection between internal findings and potential government inquiries requires a sophisticated approach to waivers. Sometimes, a company may feel compelled to waive its privilege to demonstrate cooperation with regulators like the Department of Justice or the SEC. This is never a decision to take lightly, as a waiver in one context can often be interpreted by courts as a subject matter waiver in others, completely dismantling your protections. Always keep the legal department in the loop before sharing any investigative reports with external parties or third-party auditors. Your goal is to maximize the utility of the investigation while minimizing the legal surface area exposed to external adversaries. Diligent maintenance of this structure is a core competency for any professional responsible for organizational integrity. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and let us turn our attention to the practical application of consequences within a compliance program. Enforcing disciplinary actions reliably serves as the backbone of an effective compliance and ethics program, reinforcing the principle that rules have real-world weight. When an organization identifies misconduct, the failure to apply consistent disciplinary measures undermines the entire integrity of the internal control environment. The Department of Justice explicitly emphasizes that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done across all hierarchical levels. If a junior employee faces termination for a policy violation while an executive receives a mere reprimand for an identical infraction, the organization exposes itself to significant legal and regulatory scrutiny. Such disparate treatment signals to the workforce that compliance is optional for those in power, which inevitably erodes the prevailing ethical culture. Consistency in discipline ensures that employees understand that accountability is not a subjective metric, but a fundamental requirement of their professional standing. Therefore, organizations must maintain documented guidelines that mandate proportionality in how they respond to specific breaches of conduct. To ensure these disciplinary frameworks function as intended, compliance departments often integrate compliance-related metrics into the standard performance management process. Performance reviews should not only track output or financial targets, but also evaluate an individual's adherence to ethical expectations and corporate policies. When we link these behaviors to incentive structures, we create a tangible feedback loop that encourages proactive compliance. Bonuses and promotions should be contingent upon a clean compliance record, just as they are contingent upon meeting any other key performance indicator. Furthermore, the inclusion of clawback provisions in compensation agreements allows the organization to recover funds from executives who have overseen or participated in conduct that leads to financial or reputational damage. By systematically applying these tools, the organization transitions from a reactive disciplinary model to one that actively shapes employee behavior through structural incentives. This alignment confirms that the pursuit of commercial goals is always secondary to the necessity of ethical conduct. Corrective action is rarely effective if it ends with the individual. It must also involve robust remediation plans to address the systemic root causes of the misconduct. When an investigation reveals a policy violation, the focus must shift toward identifying where the control infrastructure failed to prevent the incident from occurring. This might involve updating obsolete policies, enhancing training modules to cover new risk areas, or restructuring internal processes to tighten oversight. A remediation plan functions similarly to a software patch, addressing the specific vulnerability that allowed the breach to happen in the first instance. If a lack of oversight in the procurement department led to a bribery event, the remediation must focus on implementing more rigorous approval workflows. Failure to remediate suggests that the organization is willing to tolerate known risks, which fundamentally weakens its defense if it ever faces a regulatory inquiry into its culture. Managing third-party risk is an extension of this disciplinary and corrective philosophy, as companies remain legally responsible for the actions of their agents, distributors, and vendors. A compliance officer must ensure that the organization performs comprehensive due diligence before onboarding any external partner who will represent the company's interests. This involves a tiered risk approach, where partners with higher exposure to sensitive jurisdictions or regulatory landscapes receive more intense scrutiny than low-risk support vendors. Once the partnership begins, the compliance team must conduct ongoing monitoring and periodic auditing to maintain assurance of the third party's ethical conduct. If a third party fails to meet the organization's standards, there must be a predefined mechanism to terminate the relationship, much like internal disciplinary actions. This ensures that the external ecosystem remains as compliant as the internal environment. Mergers and acquisitions present another critical domain where the enforcement of disciplinary and compliance standards must be swift and decisive. During pre-acquisition due diligence, the organization must assess the target company's existing compliance program to identify potential liabilities that could transfer upon closing. If the target company has a history of poor discipline or a weak culture, the acquirer must have a transition plan ready to integrate its own, more rigorous standards immediately. Post-acquisition, there should be no grace periods for fundamental ethical breaches, as the new entity is now operating under the parent company's risk profile. Leaders must quickly evaluate the target's employees and processes, replacing or upgrading controls where those from the target company prove inadequate. Successful integration requires a firm stance that all employees, regardless of their original company's previous culture, are now subject to the updated compliance requirements. Finally, we must measure the effectiveness of these efforts using data-driven program evaluation metrics that align with the federal sentencing guidelines. Metrics are not merely for show. They provide empirical evidence that the disciplinary process is functioning as designed. We track metrics such as the time taken to close investigations, the consistency of sanctions applied across departments, and the rate of recidivism among employees who have undergone remedial training. These data points allow the board and oversight committees to verify that the compliance program is effectively detecting and correcting risks. If the metrics indicate that specific regions or business units are consistently failing to adhere to standards, those areas must become the immediate focus of management attention and additional training. A mature program uses this cycle of observation, analysis, and response to ensure that ethics remains a living, breathing component of the organizational strategy. I look forward to our next session together. Welcome back to our exploration of the compliance landscape. In this session, we will examine the critical nexus between organizational incentive structures and ethical performance. When we discuss discipline within a compliance framework, we often focus primarily on the punitive side of the equation. Yet the proactive alignment of incentives with ethical behavior is arguably more significant. If an organization speaks about the importance of integrity, but simultaneously incentivizes aggressive sales targets without regard for how those numbers are achieved, it has effectively signaled that compliance is secondary to profit. The Department of Justice, particularly within its guidance on the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, explicitly looks for evidence that a firm integrates compliance and ethics into its performance management systems. This means that a stellar financial performer who consistently violates code of conduct policies should not be shielded from consequences by their commercial success. By linking bonuses, promotions, and other forms of compensation to compliance metrics, The organization transforms abstract policy statements into tangible daily priorities for employees and management alike. Consistency is the bedrock of a credible disciplinary and incentive framework, and the lack thereof is a primary indicator of a compromised culture. If middle management faces immediate disciplinary action for minor policy deviations, while executives receive performance bonuses despite systemic breaches, the entire compliance architecture loses its legitimacy. Such disparate treatment creates an environment where employees feel that the rules apply only to those without influence, which serves to undermine the tone at the top we strive so hard to build. To effectively mitigate this, the compliance function must work closely with human resources to establish objective criteria for performance reviews that explicitly weigh ethical compliance as highly as operational output. Clawback provisions are increasingly being utilized in executive contracts to ensure that even significant financial gains can be reversed if they are later proven to be the result of fraudulent activity or a failure to supervise subordinates properly. This mechanism serves as a powerful deterrent and shifts the internal perception of risk from a distant hypothetical problem to a personal fiscal responsibility. Beyond individual performance metrics, the broader approach to discipline must focus on systematic remediation rather than merely scapegoating individuals who have committed misconduct. When a policy failure occurs, the response should not be limited to firing the person responsible. It must include a deep dive analysis into the root causes that allowed the behavior to persist. If an audit reveals that a sales team circumvented procurement controls, the remediation plan must look at whether those controls were overly burdensome or if the training provided was sufficient for the risks present in that specific market. Organizations must document these remediation efforts meticulously, as they serve as proof to regulators that the company is capable of self-correction. By focusing on root cause analysis, we move away from a reactionary compliance model and toward a proactive one, which consistently demonstrates a commitment to organizational growth and ethical health in the face of identified systemic failures. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. This lecture focuses on the necessity of structured remediation following the identification of compliance failures or misconduct. A remediation plan is not merely a reactionary document meant to satisfy auditors. It is a strategic tool designed to address the root causes of systemic failures. When we identify a breakdown in controls, we must move beyond repairing the immediate symptoms to examining the underlying architecture of our compliance program. The Department of Justice emphasizes that a truly effective program discovers why a breach occurred and uses that intelligence to close control gaps permanently. This often involves a rigorous review of how the policy failed to prevent the incident, whether through lack of clarity, insufficient verification, or the absence of appropriate oversight mechanisms. You should approach remediation as a technical exercise in causal analysis, tracing the failure back to its origin point within your business processes. By adopting a systematic approach, you ensure that the same vulnerability does not manifest in another part of the organization. The primary objective of developing a remediation plan is the modification of existing controls to prevent recurrence. If an employee bypassed an approval threshold to facilitate an improper payment, the remediation should not stop at disciplining that employee. Instead, one must evaluate whether the financial system permitted that bypass due to a technical configuration error or a lack of secondary review requirements. A robust plan includes specific, measurable actions, such as updating internal policies, enhancing automated monitoring triggers, or restructuring the approval workflow entirely. It is essential that these plans are documented in detail, providing a clear audit trail that demonstrates to regulators that the organization has learned from its mistakes. Think of this as refactoring code. You are identifying the technical debt in your compliance program and paying it down to ensure future stability. Effective remediation likewise requires clear ownership and defined project timelines. A plan without an accountable owner who has the authority to implement systemic change will eventually suffer from drift and neglect. Each action item within the plan needs a designated point of contact and a deadline for verification, ensuring that the control operates as intended after the fix. You should also consider how the updated controls interact with other parts of the ethics ecosystem, as shifting one policy might inadvertently create a friction point elsewhere. Coordination with IT, human resources, and operational departments is therefore not optional, but rather a prerequisite for long-term effectiveness. When you integrate these changes, you effectively harden the organization against similar risks, satisfying both internal audit standards and the expectations articulated by the federal sentencing guidelines. Data integrity serves as the backbone of any remediation effort. Without tracking the performance of the new or modified controls, it is impossible to determine if the remediation was truly successful or merely a superficial adjustment. You must define metrics that look for the absence of the previously identified misconduct to validate the effectiveness of your containment strategy. For instance, if you implemented a new review cycle for third-party disbursements, you should monitor that specific control for timely completion and accuracy. This feedback loop allows for the continuous refinement of the compliance program, moving the organization from a posture of constant maintenance to one of mature, proactive risk management. Treat your remediation efforts as evidence of a living, evolving ethics program rather than a static document. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and let's turn our attention to the complexities of managing third-party risk. This session explores how to extend your compliance program beyond your own walls to address the significant exposures created by vendors and agents. In the eyes of regulators, particularly the Department of Justice, an organization is frequently held liable for the actions of its business partners. If a third party acting on your behalf pays a bribe or mishandles private data, the legal and reputational fallout lands squarely on your organization. Consequently, managing third-party risk is not merely an optional best practice, but a fundamental requirement for any effective compliance program. You cannot simply outsource your risks. You must instead manage the relationship through a lifecycle approach that begins well before a contract is signed. This requires a systematic methodology that encompasses due diligence, risk tiering, ongoing monitoring, and, when necessary, disciplined offboarding. By systematizing these efforts, you reduce the likelihood of regulatory enforcement actions that often cite inadequate oversight of agents and intermediaries as a primary failure point. The process starts with rigorous due diligence, which serves as your first line of defense before contractual obligations are established. Rather than treating all vendors as identical, you must implement a risk tiering process that categorizes third parties based on their geographical location, the nature of their business, and their interactions with government officials. A distributor operating in a high corruption jurisdiction requires far more scrutiny than a domestic supplier of office equipment. During the onboarding phase, you should collect information that goes beyond simple financial stability, focusing instead on their own internal compliance controls and any history of legal or ethical lapses. This data gathering allows you to make an informed, risk-based decision about whether to proceed with the relationship and, if so, what specific contractual obligations regarding compliance must be included. Once the contract is active, your work shifts to continuous monitoring rather than passive observation. You must track whether the vendor is adhering to the compliance code they signed during onboarding, perhaps by auditing their invoices, conducting field visits, or requiring periodic compliance certifications. If a supplier fails to meet these standards, your program must have an established mechanism for remediation or termination. This is the offboarding phase, which is often neglected but remains critical for closing the loop on potential liabilities. By treating third-party risk as a continuous life cycle, you replace ad hoc checking with a durable control structure that keeps the organization resilient against external threats. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this exploration of how compliance frameworks adapt during the complex volatility of mergers and acquisitions. We will focus specifically on maintaining integrity and oversight when two distinct organizational cultures and control environments converge. When an organization engages in an acquisition, the compliance function is often sidelined in favor of financial synergies. Yet the Department of Justice views mergers as significant moments of risk. Every acquisition carries the inherent danger of inheriting systemic misconduct, legacy liabilities, or inadequate control frameworks from the target entity. From a professional standpoint, your objective is to ensure that the due diligence process goes far beyond financial auditing. You must assess the maturity of the target's compliance program, specifically asking whether their policies are merely paper-based or if they reflect genuine operational reality. This involves looking for evidence of training compliance, the history of internal investigations, and the quality of their reporting mechanisms. If you fail to identify these gaps before the deal closes, your organization assumes full legal responsibility for those pre-existing failures. The goal is to perform a pre-acquisition risk assessment that identifies these liabilities and calculates the cost of remediation into the overall deal valuation. This is not just a defensive measure, but a strategic necessity to protect the acquirer's reputation and legal standing. Post-acquisition integration represents the second half of this critical phase, where you must transition the target company from its native environment into your own standardized compliance ecosystem. The integration must be swift, as regulators often expect the acquiring company to exert operational control over the new entity shortly after the transaction is finalized. You cannot simply expect a target company to adopt your code of conduct by osmosis. You must actively map their existing controls to your own and identify where gaps exist. This phase requires an immediate rollout of your own compliance standards, starting with foundational policies and anti-corruption requirements that are likely higher than those previously maintained by the target. You should conduct immediate training for all incoming employees to ensure they understand your specific reporting obligations and anti-retaliation policies. Additionally, all legacy third-party relationships held by the target must be rescreened using your established risk tiering methodology. Integration is complete only when the target entity is fully embedded into your auditing and monitoring workflow, ensuring that their performance metrics are consistent with your organizational standards. Establishing a clear path toward program evaluation metrics is the final piece of this puzzle, as the effectiveness of your compliance efforts must be quantifiable across the entire enterprise. Federal sentencing guidelines emphasize that a program is not considered effective simply because it exists in writing. It must show evidence of reaching outcomes. You need to develop metrics that reflect the health of your compliance culture, such as the engagement levels with internal reports or the timely closure of remediation plans. These metrics allow you to demonstrate to regulators that your compliance function is dynamic rather than static. By tracking how effectively you identify and respond to misconduct, you create a feedback loop that feeds directly into continuous improvement. When metrics indicate a dip in effectiveness following a merger, it serves as an early warning system that your integration efforts may need recalibration. Using data to drive these decisions removes the subjectivity from compliance management and replaces it with an evidence-based approach to institutional risk management. Talk to you in the next session. Welcome back to our journey towards CCEP certification. In this lecture, we will explore the essential metrics used to evaluate the overall effectiveness of your compliance program. To evaluate a compliance program effectively, we must move beyond simply counting activities and start quantifying outcomes. The Department of Justice emphasizes that a program should not be merely a check-the-box exercise, but a living system that evolves based on data. When we talk about program evaluation metrics, we are essentially looking for evidence that the program is preventing, detecting, and responding to misconduct in a measurable way. We need to track the velocity and volume of reports, the time it takes to close an investigation, and the consistency of disciplinary actions taken across various levels of the organization. By doing so, we satisfy the expectations set out in the federal sentencing guidelines, which require organizations to periodically assess the effectiveness of their compliance and ethics programs. These metrics are not just internal KPIs. They are the artifacts you will present to regulators to prove that your compliance architecture is robust, objective, and well-resourced. If you cannot measure it, you cannot prove its value to the board or, more importantly, to the relevant oversight authorities who evaluate your program during an enforcement action. One of the most critical areas for metric development is the assessment of third-party risk management. Since an organization is legally liable for the actions of its vendors, agents, and distributors, your metrics must reflect the entire life cycle of these relationships. You should track the number of due diligence screenings performed, the percentage of vendors that fall into high-risk categories, and the frequency of audits conducted on these entities. It is not enough to simply onboard a partner. You must demonstrate ongoing monitoring and successful offboarding when risks become unmanageable. If your metrics show that you are performing deep due diligence but rarely initiating follow-up audits, you have identified a significant control gap that requires immediate remediation. This data-driven perspective allows you to allocate your limited compliance resources toward the third parties that present the highest residual risk to your company. We also look at metrics related to human capital and organizational culture, such as the integration of compliance performance into incentive structures. You should monitor how often compliance-related goals are included in performance reviews and whether bonuses are actually adjusted based on ethical behavior. Tracking the usage of clawback provisions, even if rarely invoked, serves as a powerful indicator of a culture that holds leadership accountable for systemic ethics failures. It is also important to evaluate the quality of your remediation plans following identified misconduct. This involves measuring whether root causes were truly addressed by policy updates or training enhancements, rather than just treating the symptoms of a single incident. When you report these metrics to the board, you provide them with the empirical basis for their oversight responsibilities, ensuring that they can make informed decisions about the risk appetite of the firm. Finally, we must consider the metrics associated with mergers and acquisitions, which represent periods of heightened vulnerability for any organization. During the pre-acquisition phase, your metrics should track the completion rates of risk assessments for the target entity to ensure no unknown toxic liabilities are inherited. Once the integration process begins, you need to transition to metrics that measure the speed at which the target company is brought into alignment with the acquirer's control environment. This includes tracking the percentages of the new workforce that have completed core training and the number of legacy issues successfully resolved through integration. By standardizing these evaluation metrics, you create a repeatable framework that protects the organization during aggressive growth phases. These quantitative inputs allow the compliance team to provide a clear, evidence-based roadmap for program improvement that survives the scrutiny of external auditors and regulatory bodies alike. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the final review of our shared journey through the CCEP curriculum. We will now synthesize the core pillars of compliance to ensure your readiness for the certification exam. As we reach the conclusion of this curriculum, it is worth pausing to reflect on the core scaffolding that holds an effective compliance program together. At the heart of our practice lie the federal sentencing guidelines, specifically the principles outlined in Chapter 8, which define what constitutes an effective organizational compliance and ethics program. These are not merely suggestions, but the baseline against which regulators and prosecutors assess whether a company has exercised due diligence. Whether you are drafting a global policy or conducting an internal investigation, every action must be traceable back to these foundational expectations. By understanding the intent behind these guidelines, you move away from a check-the-box mentality toward building a defensible architectural framework that can withstand external scrutiny. True mastery requires you to view the DOJ evaluation metrics and OIG guidance as diagnostic tools that reveal the health of your internal controls. The interconnectedness of our subject matter cannot be overstated, as no department operates in a vacuum within a healthy organization. Your work on standards and procedures provides the necessary guidance, but that guidance is inert without the practical reality of board oversight and management alignment. When you identify a risk, whether it involves anti-corruption, data privacy, or third-party exposure, you are not just creating a risk register entry. You are initiating a feedback loop that informs your training strategy, dictates your auditing priorities, and helps define your disciplinary standards. This holistic view is the primary marker of a seasoned compliance professional who understands that a reporting hotline is only effective if your non-retaliation policies are culturally embedded and rigorously enforced. Every piece of this program is a relay, where the output of your risk assessment becomes the input for your audit department and the context for your training curriculum. As you prepare for the examination, think deeply about how you bridge the gap between abstract corporate governance and the tangible reality of daily business operations. You have explored the nuances of internal controls and the precision required for conducting investigations while managing client privilege. You have analyzed how to incentivize ethical behavior and how to deploy corrective actions that remediate flaws rather than simply penalizing mistakes. These skills are essential, particularly when navigating the high-pressure environments of mergers and acquisitions or managing risk in fragile third-party relationships. The goal of this certification is to validate your ability to act as a steward of organizational integrity under diverse and complex regulatory demands. You are now equipped to navigate these complexities with a focus on defensibility, repeatability, and commitment to a culture of continuous improvement. Transitioning from study to practice, and eventually to the exam room, requires you to trust in the analytical framework we have established together. Remember that the questions you will face are designed to test your ability to apply these principles in the gray areas of corporate life, where perfect answers are rare, but defensible decisions are required. Look for the underlying regulatory objective in every question, as this will help you filter out distractions and focus on the most viable path forward. Maintain your focus on the goal of ensuring that your organization's ethics program is a proactive engine, not merely a reactive defense. You have covered the theory, the mechanics, and the strategic positioning required to lead effectively. Trust your preparation, approach the testing environment with a clinical eye, and rely on the systematic thinking that characterizes a true professional. I wish you the best of luck on your certification exam. See you whenever you tackle your next section.